We were supposed to be heading to this music festival about 4 hours north of the city. It had been on the calendar for months. I had the car packed the night before. Tent, sleeping bags, camp chairs, cooler loaded with food and beer, a couple bottles of liquor, Bluetooth speaker, rolling papers, lighters, the works. My friend Tara had even printed out the set list and made us a playlist for the drive. We were hyped, but right as we were about to pull out of the driveway, Tara checked her phone and her face just dropped. The whole festival had been canceled. Some permit issue or whether, I don't remember. Whatever the reason, we were crushed. The weekend we'd planned for months was gone in a single notification. We sat in the car, parked at the curb, just kind of stunned for a second. Then I said, screw it, we were all packed and already mentally out the door, so why not still go somewhere? Just pick a direction and drive, find a campground, make our own weekend. No schedule, no crowds, no overpriced beer, no waiting in line for filthy porta potties. Just us, the open road, and a couple nights under the stars. Tara didn't take much convincing. We drove north anyway, still blasting the playlist we'd made. About 2.5 hours upstate, we came across this little lakeside resort town. One of those seasonal places that probably gets busy in summer but looks like a ghost town the second Labor Day passes. Rows of shuttered gift shops and ice cream stands, docks pulled in, and that kind of dead quiet you only find in places that live by the calendar. Still, the lake looked beautiful. The trees were just starting to turn. The air had that clean, cool bite to it. We figured it would do just fine. We found a small campground maybe 5 or 6 minutes outside the main strip. It was open, but obviously barely operating. The little check-in booth looked like it hadn't seen fresh paint in a decade. The sign said cash only, and the lights inside flickered even though it was broad daylight. A guy was sitting inside when we pulled up. Looked mid-50s, rail-thin, leathery skin like someone who'd smoked for 30 years but quit cold turkey. He had this kind of weathered look like someone who lived out here year-round. Friendly enough though. Gave us the rundown. Yes, they were open, but only just. Said we'd probably be the only ones here since the season was pretty much over. We paid for 2 nights and he gave us a map and circled a spot. Said it was a nice quiet corner by the trees. When we drove in, we realized he meant the quiet corner. He'd stuck us way in the back of the campground, far from the main entrance. Literally the last loop in the whole place. The road ended at our site, and beyond that it was just dense woods. We were surrounded by empty lots, picnic tables overturned for the season, fire pits full of old ashes. The bathrooms and water spigots were a good walk back toward the center. Not a single other camper or tent in sight. At first we joked about it. Tara said the guy probably saw the city plates on the car and decided to mess with us. I said I didn't mind, it was what we wanted anyway. Just the 2 of us, far from people, with no one to tell us to turn down the music or complain about the smell of weed. We pitched the tent, set up the chairs, got a fire going, cracked some beers. It was actually a perfect afternoon. Cool but not cold. No bugs, no kids screaming. Just birds and wind and that peaceful lake smell you only get upstate. We cooked some hot dogs, played music, got a little buzzed and laughed a lot. As the sun went down, the place got really quiet. Like press your ear into the darkness kind of quiet. Even the birds shut up. It wasn't scary at first, just still. No traffic sounds. No people talking. Not even the rustle of raccoons in the brush. Just wind. Constant, soft, pushing wind through the trees. Everything else had stopped. Around 10, we climbed into the tent. It was the newer kind with double walls and those corner pouches you can put your phone and flashlight into. We zipped ourselves in, clicked off the lantern, and lay back. That's when we heard it. It started as this dry, metallic scrape. Slow, even deliberate. Not the sound of something hitting something else, but dragging across it. Like metal on stone. Not chaotic, not hurried. Methodical, measured. Almost like someone working with focus. It came from off to the left, maybe 100 yards into the woods or one of the empty sites. There was nothing else over there, just thick trees and brush. But the sound was clear. Over the dead silence of the night, it carried like it was 20 feet away. Tara stiffened up right away. I could feel her breath stop. I froze too. We listened for a minute and it repeated. A long scrape, pause, another, again, and again, and again. After a few cycles, I said it had to be some kind of animal. Maybe a raccoon dragged something metallic into the woods, or a deer stepped on something weird. But I didn't believe it. The sound was too precise, too clean. There was no scuffling, no footsteps, just scrape, pause, scrape. I tried to laugh it off, but I wasn't fully convincing even myself. Tara wasn't buying it at all. She whispered to me that it sounded like someone sharpening a blade, not with a tool but with a stone. And once she said that, I couldn't unhear it. That's exactly what it sounded like. That long, gritty sound of metal grinding on rock, slow and careful. She started freaking out a little, saying the guy at the booth was probably trying to scare us. She wanted to leave. I told her it would take the guy at least 10 minutes to hike out here, and we hadn't heard any footsteps or twigs breaking. There was no noise except for that sharpening. Whoever it was would have had to sneak through the woods, completely silent, in the dark while carrying a blade. It didn't make sense. We would have heard them. Just to be sure, she called the check-in booth. The guy picked up. Tara asked if anyone else had checked in since us. He said no. We asked if he was alone at the booth. He said yes. She asked if he'd been there the whole time. Again, yes. We hung up. He was half a mile away, and the sharpening hadn't stopped. Whoever was doing it, it wasn't him, unless he had a twin and a tunnel under the lake. That's when it really hit me. Someone else was out here. Someone not supposed to be. Maybe a squatter, a drifter, or worse, someone who knew this campground was abandoned and was waiting for the right time to come back to it. I opened the tent, peeked out, couldn't see anything. The moonlight was too weak under the trees, and the fire had gone to embers. The sound was still going, steady, not loud, but unmistakable. I told Tara we should get in the car. We grabbed our phones, the keys, a flashlight, and the can of bear mace we'd brought just in case. We left the rest. We didn't even zip up the tent. The car was maybe 30 feet away, parked at the edge of the site. We made a run for it, jumped in, locked the doors, sat in the front seats, breathing hard. I kept the headlights off, didn't want to let anyone know we were awake. The flashlight stayed in my lap, but I didn't turn it on either. We sat there for hours. The sharpening never stopped. It slowed sometimes, then picked back up, always in the same rhythm, like whoever was doing it never got tired. Just long, slow strokes, back and forth, sometimes faster, then slower again. Tara eventually passed out sometime after 2 a.m. Couldn't sleep. I just stared through the windshield, bear mace in one hand, flashlight in the other. Every few minutes I thought I saw a figure, or movement, or glint of light in the trees. But it never came closer, and I didn't dare get out. Around 5:30, just before the sky started to turn gray, the sound stopped. Not faded, stopped. Dead silent again. No scrape, no hustli, no footstep. Just gone. I stayed put, watched the woods. Nothing moved. No birds chirped. That weird stillness was back, like the whole forest was holding its breath. The sun finally rose. The woods lit up. Everything looked normal again. Trees, leaves, some squirrels on a branch. But when I got out and walked the area with the flashlight, there was nothing. No person, no tracks, no tools. Just our tent, a half-dead fire, and woods. I even went down the slope where I thought the sound had come from. Didn't see anything, but I felt something, like the place didn't want me there. We packed fast, didn't even eat. We were out of that campground by 7 a.m. sharp. Back at the booth, the guy wasn't surprised to see us so early. He just gave a little nod and said, "Hope the site was peaceful." I didn't answer. I didn't want to talk about it. That was 2 years ago. I've camped since then, but never again in the off-season. Never again in an empty campground. Never again without a second car or someone else nearby. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know why they never came closer or made a move. But I still hear that sound sometimes in my sleep. Long, slow, scrape, and I always wake up just before the sun rises. My girlfriend at the time and I had planned the camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a joint celebration, her birthday and our anniversary, all rolled into one weekend. We lived in a mid-sized city, and the campsite we picked was about 5 hours away, tucked deep in the national forest. She'd found it on a camping blog. The photos looked amazing. Dense pine trees, a few scattered trails, a lake not too far off. Remote, quiet, exactly what we thought we wanted. The weekend finally came. A major storm had passed through the area the night before. One of those slow-moving spring systems that dump rain for hours, soak everything through, and then move on like nothing happened. I remember the sound of it beating against my bedroom window. I had half a mind to call the trip off, but we'd already taken time off work, and the forecast for the rest of the weekend looked clear. We left early that Friday morning. The roads were still slick in places, but the sun had started to come out. There was a sharp freshness in the air, that clean smell after a big rain. We had the windows cracked. The drive was long, but quiet. A lot of flat stretches, trees, power lines, the usual. She napped on and off, and I drove, zoning out for long stretches behind the wheel. 5 hours can feel like 2 when you're spaced out. We pulled into the campground a little after 1 in the afternoon. The office was just a small trailer near the gate with a wooden overhang and a single gas generator humming off to the side. There was one guy working, maybe mid-60s, camouflage cap, heavy green jacket, beat-up notebook in his hand. He flipped through it, found our names, and nodded. "Just you two," he said, then added, "Y'all got the place to yourselves this weekend. Nobody else checked in. Kinda rare for this time of year." I remember thinking that sounded awesome, like we had our own slice of forest all to ourselves. I looked over at my girlfriend and she grinned. We thought it was perfect. No other campers, no noisy groups with Bluetooth speakers, just us, trees, and some peace. He gave us a rough map. Our campsite, Lot 7, was one of the more secluded ones, he said, right at the end of a narrow dirt road, backed up against a thicket of woods. "Good spot for privacy," he said. "Just a heads up, road back there gets real tight. Gotta back out when you leave." We drove in and followed the winding road. The further we got, the more isolated it felt. No other cars, no other people, just tree branches arching overhead like a tunnel. Lot 1, Lot 2, 3. We kept going until the signs stopped altogether. Eventually, the road narrowed down to just one car width, all lined with mud and soaked leaves. At the end of it, a small clearing opened up. That was Lot 7. It was a nice little spot, to be honest. Plenty of room for the tent, a rusted fire pit, a flimsy picnic table that wobbled if you leaned too hard on one end. You could still hear the water dripping from the trees from the storm the night before. Everything smelled wet. The dirt was soft. The air felt cold even in the daylight. We got the tent set up without too much trouble. It was one of those pop-up styles with poles already threaded through. Nothing fancy, but it did the job. We brought one ice chest, a couple duffel bags, some camp chairs, and a bag of food. We didn't pack light, but we didn't overdo it either. Enough for a night or two. Once the tent was ready, we decided to explore. The sun was still out, though the light filtered through the clouds and tree cover in patches. It wasn't quiet in the peaceful way, it was quiet in the kind of way that makes you notice the silence. No birds, no wind, just your own footsteps on damp leaves and the occasional drop of water falling from a branch. We followed a deer trail that led deeper into the woods. It felt untouched, as if no one had been through in weeks. A few miles in, we came across a strange clearing. It wasn't on the map the guy gave us, and we hadn't seen any signs pointing to it. In that clearing were 6 or 7 small white cabins, all identical, single door, narrow windows, no numbers, no porches, just squat little buildings sitting in the mud, perfectly lined up. There were no lights, no signs of life, no cars. They looked clean, like someone had recently washed the outsides, but we couldn't figure out why they were there. They didn't look abandoned, but they didn't look lived in either. We didn't say much, just looked at each other, then turned back around. I could tell she didn't like it there. I didn't either. It wasn't just that it was weird, It felt like we shouldn't have found it, like we had stepped into somewhere off limits without meaning to. When we got back to our site, the sun was getting lower. We tried to build a fire in the pit, but we were clueless. Neither of us had been camping before. We had 2 self-lighting logs from Walmart, a half-used bottle of lighter fluid, and nothing else. Every stick we found snapped like it was soaked inside. Even the leaves crumbled wet. We kept at it, struggling with matches and wet twigs, until we finally got a small flame going. It was barely a fire, but it was enough to roast hot dogs and melt a few marshmallows. That was the best part of the night. Sitting there, warm faces, cold backs, the soft crackle of the tiny fire. She leaned against me, and for a second, it felt like what we had pictured when we planned the trip. But the second that fire died, the mood shifted. The darkness out there wasn't like the dark in the city. It wasn't the absence of light from buildings or cars or street lamps. It was a kind of darkness that swallowed everything. The tent felt smaller. The woods felt bigger. The wind picked up just slightly, but it made every tree creak. Every leaf that moved sounded like footsteps. She got nervous first. I could see it in how she sat, how she looked around too much. Eventually, she asked if we could go into the tent. So we put out the fire and crawled in. We zipped up and laid on our backs. I tried to keep it light, talking about random things, but she wasn't into it. I could feel the tension. After a while, she put her hand over my mouth and whispered, "Listen." I held my breath, and then I heard it too. Footsteps, dull thuds on wet earth. Not close yet, but steady, like a group walking slowly. You could tell they weren't animals. Too rhythmic, too heavy. Then came the mumbling. Low, soft, but clearly voices. Not loud enough to hear words. Just the tone. Not angry, not laughing. Just talking. I felt my chest tighten. I looked at her, and I knew she was panicking. We laid there for what felt like forever, listening to the sounds grow louder, closer, until it felt like they were just outside the tent, inches away, maybe even circling us. Then silence. No footsteps.
No voices.
Nothing. Just a long, stretched stillness that made me sweat under my jacket. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. Maybe 10. Maybe 30. Then she whispered, "We have to go to the car." I slowly unzipped the tent and stuck my head out. The dark was thick. I could only see a few feet ahead with my flashlight. Trees, our chairs, the fire pit. All still there. Nothing else. I told her to stay close, and we ran. The second the car doors shut, I locked them. My hands were shaking. She kept saying, over and over, "What was that? Who was that? There's nobody else here." We sat for a minute. I looked around. Nothing moved.
No lights. No noise.
I told her to stay put. I had to grab our stuff. I ran back, grabbed the ice chest first, tossed it in the back seat, then turned to the tent, and I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, faster. I didn't even think. I ripped the tent from the stakes, didn't bother folding it, just bundled the whole thing up, wrapped the tarp around it, and dragged it to the car like I was carrying a body. Slammed it into the trunk, got in, locked the doors, asked, "Do we have everything?" She nodded. I hit reverse and gunned it. We made it back to the fork in the road, but there were too many paths. No signs.
No markings.
Just 6 muddy roads going into different parts of the woods. Picked one, drove for a minute, ended up in another campsite. Wrong one, backed up again. That's when I noticed a tiny sign, half covered by brush, tucked behind a rotted post. It pointed toward the main road.
No arrow.
Just a small wooden plank with the word exit burned into it. I followed it. As we drove out, just before the last curve, I saw something in the trees to the right. A green light, faint, still, hanging there like a signal. Then it was gone. We didn't stop, didn't talk, just drove the 5 hours home, got to her parents' place around 4 in the morning. Fell asleep on their couch without even changing clothes. We never went camping again, and we never talked about that night, ever. Years ago, my girlfriend and I were both teachers. Every June, when school was out for summer, we would take a group of kids camping for a few days. It had become a kind of tradition. We'd organize a trip to this campground nestled deep in the woods, near a small, quiet lake. The site was perfect. A flat clearing big enough for a 12-person tent, a sturdy picnic table, and a fire ring built from smooth river stones. It was remote enough to feel like an adventure, but not so far that it was dangerous. We'd spend the days hiking and exploring, and the nights gathered around the fire telling stories. The campground was known locally for a legend, the Jersey Devil. Over the years, there had been many reported sightings in the area. Of course, these were just stories we shared with the kids around the campfire. They loved it. The thrill of hearing a scary story in the dark woods was part of the fun, and every year they couldn't wait to come back. We had been doing this for 5 years by the time what I'm about to tell you happened. Nothing had ever gone wrong during any of the trips, no accidents, no strange events. Just the usual bugs, dirt, tired kids, and happy memories. But on this last trip, on the final night, something happened that I still can't explain. It was the kind of moment that changes the way you think about the woods and what might be out there. We had finished the usual routine of campfire stories. The kids were tucked safely inside the big tent, fast asleep after a long day of hiking and swimming in the lake. My girlfriend and I sat by the fire in our fold-out beach chairs, just relaxing. We had brought along our new puppy, a small, energetic thing barely old enough to be away from her mother. We tied her to the tent with a long lead so she could run around the campsite without getting lost. She was happy enough to trot around sniffing the grass and poking at sticks. The night was calm, the kind of stillness you only get deep in the woods where the nearest road is miles away. The fire crackled softly, and we had a propane torch sitting on the picnic table, giving off a steady light to keep the dark at bay. Then suddenly the fire logs collapsed on one side. The flames dimmed quickly as the pile settled unevenly. At the exact same moment, the propane torch's light flickered and dimmed until it was almost off. The whole campsite went nearly pitch black. The puppy, who was right next to me, immediately began growling low and deep in her throat. Every hair on her back stood straight up. I could feel her tense body, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the circle of weak firelight. Then I saw it. Out of the lake, about 20 yards from where we were sitting, something large emerged. At first, I thought it was a person. Someone stupid enough to be out here at this hour, maybe a lost camper or a drunk. But then it moved strangely, bending over on all fours. It wasn't running like a man, it was running like an animal, but not like any animal I had ever seen. The shape was dark, almost a silhouette in the shadows. It was tall, with a back that sloped down sharply from a high rear end to a low front. It moved smoothly, effortlessly, and without any hurry. It trotted past the firelight, then disappeared into the woods near our site. It wasn't a bear, a dog, or a deer. Those I knew well from past trips and from growing up in the area. It wasn't any normal animal. The shape, the movement, the way it seemed to flow on the ground, it was something else entirely. My heart pounded. I jumped up and ran to my car parked a short distance away. I flicked on the headlights, shining the bright beams back onto the campsite and the edge of the woods. The strong light revealed nothing out of place, no figure or movement. The campsite was empty except for us, the puppy still growling softly beside the tent. I told my girlfriend we needed to wake the kids and leave right away. I wasn't about to stay out here with whatever that thing was. But she was calmer than I was, braver really, and convinced me we should stay. After a while, we both calmed down, though I couldn't stop watching the dark woods. I lay down by the opening of the tent with a large butcher knife I'd brought, keeping it close the whole night. I didn't sleep a wink until the first weak light of dawn. The woods felt different after that. Less safe, less quiet. I haven't been back to that campground since. The trip started like any other. We loaded the van with sleeping bags, backpacks, food, and camping gear early in the morning, eager to get the kids out into the fresh air after a long school year. Our group was made up of about 10 kids, mostly middle schoolers, ranging in age from 11 to 13. They were a mix of excited and nervous, many of them having never spent more than a night or two outdoors. The drive took us a couple of hours from the city to the campground. When we arrived, the sun was already high, filtering down through tall pine and oak trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The lake was small but clear, bordered by smooth rocks and patches of wildflowers. We picked our site carefully, a flat spot near the water's edge, with enough room for our massive tent. Setting it up was always a team effort. The kids took turns helping with poles, stakes, and the heavy canvas. My girlfriend was great at organizing the group, making sure everyone had a role and was involved. The day was filled with swimming, fishing, and hiking. The kids learned how to read a compass, identify plants, and build a small shelter. We laughed, joked, and ate too many marshmallows roasted over the fire. The air was warm but not hot, perfect for camping. When night fell, we gathered around the fire ring. The flames crackled and spit sparks into the darkening sky. We passed around a flashlight and took turns telling stories. Some were silly, some were spooky, but all were fun and safe. Then I told the legend of the Jersey Devil, the creature said to haunt the Pine Barrens region, with wings, hooves, and a chilling scream. The kids loved the story, clutching their blankets and glancing nervously into the woods beyond the firelight. After the stories, we made sure the kids were settled inside the big tent, zipped up tight against the night. We gave each other quiet nods, feeling the satisfaction of another successful trip. Then my girlfriend and I settled into our chairs, lighting the propane torch to keep the darkness away. Our puppy, still full of energy, ran circles around the campsite, her leash allowing her freedom but keeping her close. For a while, everything was calm. The fire crackled and popped, the lake's surface shimmered in the moonlight, and the night sounds of crickets and frogs filled the air. Then the logs suddenly shifted. I was watching the fire closely, noticing how the flames danced when the logs tipped over. The fire's brightness dimmed as the logs settled, and at the same time, the propane torch's flame flickered and then almost went out. I was startled by how suddenly the light disappeared. The darkness pressed in, thick and heavy, almost like a physical weight. That's when the puppy started growling. Her low growl was tense, full of warning. She stood rigid, ears pointed forward, eyes locked on the water just beyond our campsite. I followed her gaze and saw the shape emerge. It was dark and low, moving from the lake to the shore on four legs, bending unnaturally. I could only make out the outline, but it was unlike any creature I'd ever seen in the woods. Its back was curved, the hind legs higher than the front. It moved quietly, without urgency, as if it had no fear of us at all. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from the picnic table and shone it toward the figure, but the light barely touched it. It moved calmly past the edge of the firelight, heading into the thicker woods behind our site. Fear gripped me. I told my girlfriend we needed to get the kids and leave immediately, but she convinced me to stay, saying we had done nothing wrong and that the figure was probably just an animal she hadn't seen before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods felt alive, silent except for the soft rustle of leaves. I stayed awake the rest of the night, knife in hand, eyes wide open. When dawn finally came, the woods looked normal again, quiet and peaceful as if nothing had happened. The next morning, we packed up quickly. The kids were still asleep, but we made sure to wake them gently and tell them we were heading home early. I've never been able to explain what I saw that night. It wasn't an animal I knew, and it certainly wasn't a human. Whatever it was, it moved with a strange grace and calm that made me uncomfortable. Since then, I haven't gone camping. The woods don't feel as safe anymore, and I don't want to risk seeing that thing again. That night changed the way I think about the outdoors. The stories we tell kids around campfires are fun and scary, but sometimes the real unknown is out there, silent and watching, waiting. And sometimes when the light fades, you can see it. I was out with my buddy Jared for a weekend camping trip in the North Georgia mountains. We'd been planning it for a few weeks. Just the two of us, a couple nights away from everything. No cell service, no work emails, no traffic. Just trees, campfires, stars, and cold beers. We both grew up hiking and fishing around Georgia, and while we weren't hardcore survivalists, we knew our way around the woods pretty well. Our plan was simple. Park near one of the lesser-known trailheads just past Vogel State Park, hike about 5 miles in along a creek, and set up camp at one of the more remote sites. That Friday, we left Atlanta around noon and made good time heading north. By the time we passed through Dahlonega and started getting into the Real Hills, we realized we'd forgotten one thing: beer. I'd packed all the food, gear, water, and even firewood, but I completely blanked on stopping at a package store before leaving the city. So we pulled off into a tiny little town, not much more than a 4-way stop and a few buildings. There was an old gas station with a grocery store attached to it, so we figured we'd stock up there. We grabbed a couple bags of chips, some peanuts, a pack of hot dogs, and then headed to the back cooler. But there was no beer, no wine, not even those weak gas station malt beverages. Just rows of soda, water, and a few off-brand energy drinks. I checked twice, even asked an old guy restocking the shelves, and he just shrugged and said something about it being a dry county. I'd forgotten that was even still a thing in some parts of Georgia. Jared came back up to the register with a pack of gum and asked the cashier if there was anywhere nearby where we could pick up a 6-pack. She was middle-aged, looked tired, and didn't seem all that interested in conversation. She just told us, without looking up, that we'd have to cross into the next county over. Said there was a bar just past the line, and gave us rough directions. It didn't sound like a real bar. No name, no address. Just follow this road until you see a fork, go left, pass a white barn, and you'll see a little brick building on the right. It's got a light above the door. She said it was only 10 or 15 minutes away, and it was getting late, so we figured why not. We didn't want to go into the woods empty-handed. The sun was starting to go down as we followed the directions. The roads narrowed and turned to gravel. Trees pressed in close on both sides. It didn't feel like we were heading toward anything commercial. No traffic, no lights, no signs of life. Just long stretches of forest broken up by the occasional rundown house or rusted-out trailer. Eventually, we came around a bend and saw it. A small brick building tucked between 2 tall pine trees. There were no signs, no name,
no windows.
Just a bricked-in square structure with a single screen door and a weak yellow bulb above it. The light barely lit the porch area, just enough to cast long shadows onto the gravel drive. The building looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The bricks were dirty and chipped, and the roof sagged a little at the edges. We pulled up but left the engine running. Neither of us said anything right away. We just sat there, looking at it. The place felt off. Not haunted or anything, just wrong. Like it didn't belong in the world we knew. It didn't give off the vibe of a bar or store. It looked more like an abandoned storage building. But the light above the door was on, and that made it worse somehow. We cracked a few nervous jokes about the movie Deliverance, laughing a little too loud, trying to make it all feel normal. But neither of us opened the door. The longer we sat there, the heavier the feeling got. Something about that place just screamed, "Don't." Then, through the screen door, I thought I saw a shadow move across the inside. It was quick, like someone passing by. That was it for me. I turned to Jared and said, "Screw it, let's just go without." He nodded fast, like he'd already decided the same thing. I backed the car out carefully, turned around, and we drove away without another word. Back on the main road, we didn't say much for a while. We both kept glancing in the rearview mirrors. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been watched. Not just seen, but studied. I didn't see another car the entire drive back to the trailhead. We made it to the campsite just before total darkness hit. Got our gear out, hiked the 5 miles in using headlamps, and set up camp by the creek like we planned. It was peaceful out there, the rushing water masking the sounds of the woods. But even after the fire was going and we were in our sleeping bags, I couldn't stop thinking about that building. That stupid single light above the door. That shadow inside. The next day, we met a few other campers in the area. Nice people. Locals, it seemed. We were all filtering water near the same bend in the creek and got to chatting. Eventually, someone brought up the town we passed through, and I mentioned we tried to find a bar just over the county line. I gave a rough description of the place we found. No sign, no windows, just a light over the door. A couple of the locals looked at each other. Then one said, almost casually, "That's not a bar." He looked kind of amused but also dead serious. Another guy added, "Never was. Not unless they opened it last night. That place has been there forever, but no one uses it." My cousin said it was a storm shelter or storage or something, but nobody goes there. "You really went up to it?" I said we'd pulled up and sat in the car, but didn't get out. He nodded slow. That was smart. And then he changed the subject. Jared and I didn't talk about it much after that. Not during the hike out, not on the drive home. It was like neither of us wanted to give it more weight by saying too much about it. But I kept thinking about that place, about how casually the cashier sent us there, about how little detail she gave, about how wrong it felt even before we knew anything about it. I thought about what would have happened if we'd gotten out of the car, knocked on the door, walked inside. There was no sound coming from that building, no music,
No voices.
just a dim light and the feeling that someone or something was waiting. In the weeks after the trip, I even tried looking it up. Searched the county name, business licenses, maps. Nothing came up. No bar listed in that area. No businesses at all in that direction. The road wasn't even marked on most maps. Just a thin gray line that vanished into the trees. I told a few friends the story later, and most of them just laughed. Said we were being paranoid. But I know what I felt. That was not a bar. It wasn't a store either. It wasn't abandoned. Someone had electricity. Someone turned that light on. And someone was inside. I haven't been back to that part of Georgia since. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I've camped plenty since then. But because there are some places where you don't belong, and something in your gut knows it before your brain ever catches up. We were lucky, I think. We trusted the feeling and we left. That was probably the best decision we made that whole trip. This past weekend started off just like any other time I've gone into the woods. Quiet, cool, and easy. It was early Friday afternoon when we arrived at the campsite. We had about 5 guys in our group, a couple dogs, and more than enough gear to get us through the weekend comfortably. The plan was simple. Spend a few days in the mountains to camp, get some scouting in for elk, maybe fish the creek a little, and unwind before hunting season kicked off next month. I was riding up with my buddy Mark. He had his 2-year-old daughter with him, tucked in one of those framed hiking carriers. Mark was an experienced hunter and outdoorsman, so I didn't think twice about him bringing her. She'd been raised around it and was probably more at home in the woods than half the adults I know. We set up camp in a clearing just off a 2-track road that cuts into the hills, a spot we'd been coming to for years. It was far enough from the main road to feel isolated, but still close enough that we could drive in and out if needed. Big trees surrounded the camp, mostly spruce and pine, with a few aspens higher up the slope. There was a small creek nearby, more of a trickle really, but it made for a good water source and added that constant trickling sound that always makes me sleep better in a tent. Friday night was uneventful. We made a fire, grilled up some venison brats, drank a few beers, and told the same dumb stories we always do. The dogs chased each other through the woods, and Mark's little girl dozed off early in her sleeping bag. Everything felt normal. The next morning, Mark and I woke up early, maybe around 6:30, while the others were still dead asleep. We both wanted to scout a new spot we hadn't checked out in a couple seasons. There's a section about a mile or so northeast of camp where the terrain opens up a bit and has a few natural clearings. We've seen sign there before: elk beds, scat, some rubs. Nothing huge, but promising. Mark strapped his daughter into the carrier. I slung on my small day pack with some water and a few snacks, and we leashed the dogs before heading out. The hike started easy. The forest was quiet that morning. Just a few chirps from the birds and the rustling of squirrels up in the trees. Sunlight hadn't broken all the way through the canopy yet, and everything had that soft, blue-tinged morning glow. I remember noticing how damp the ground was from the night dew and how good it felt to be away from the usual noise of life. The dogs stayed close, weaving back and forth across the path, sniffing everything. We cut through the woods for about 20 minutes before connecting with that old 2-track road. It's barely a road anymore, just two narrow ruts through the trees, mostly overgrown with grass and saplings in some parts. It used to be used by loggers or hunters years ago, but now it's mostly a footpath for anyone hiking back this far. We walked along the track for a bit, talking quietly, pointing out old tracks and small signs of animals. A fresh scrape on a pine tree, some dung that looked a few days old. Mark was keeping his eyes open while gently bouncing his daughter up and down on his back, and I stayed a little ahead, watching the dogs and scanning the woods for anything interesting. We were maybe 45 minutes into the hike when it happened. The sound of the rifle shot cracked so fast and so close that it stopped me in my tracks before I even had time to think. It was sharp, loud, and echoed hard off the trees. In the same split second, I heard the high-pitched snap of something whip past me. It was so fast I didn't even register what it was until it was gone. Then it hit me. Someone had just fired a bullet right between us. Mark and I were standing about 10 feet apart at that point. I spun around toward him and saw the same stunned look on his face. His daughter was still sleeping, or maybe just confused by the sudden noise. The dogs had bolted to the side, tails down, ears pinned back. One of them was growling low, the other had its belly to the dirt. My heart was pounding. My chest was tight. That sound of the bullet flying past us. It's not something I'll ever forget. If you've never heard it, it's not just a noise. It's a feeling, like the air itself got sliced. At first, I thought maybe someone had mistaken my dog for a coyote. She's lanky, has that gray-brown coat, and she tends to dart around like one too. But even then, we weren't that deep into the woods, and anyone with half a brain would have heard us walking. And we were on a Mark II track, not some hidden trail. I didn't even think. I just reacted. I sprinted up the road in the direction the shot came from, yelling at the top of my lungs. I wanted whoever was there to know they weren't just shooting at animals. They had nearly killed someone. About 30 yards up, the trees opened into a small clearing. And there he was, some guy standing there with a bolt-action rifle in his hands. He was maybe in his 30s, wearing camo pants and a dark hoodie. No blaze orange.
No vest.
Nothing to signal he was hunting, just standing there looking like a deer himself. His face said it all, wide-eyed, pale, caught. He looked like a kid who just realized the stove was hot after touching it. I stopped about 20 feet from him, keeping distance but not hiding how mad I was. My hand was already on the pistol at my hip. I didn't point it, but I didn't exactly hide it either. I wasn't trying to play cowboy, but the guy just fired a bullet between me and a man carrying a toddler. He started mouthing excuses, gesturing at the trees, the brush, saying something about birds. Couldn't believe it. This idiot was trying to say he was bird hunting, with a rifle, not a shotgun, and no orange. I kept my hand close to my sidearm while trying to stay calm. I didn't know if he was drunk, high, stupid, or all three. All I knew was that we were one wrong move away from something that could change both our lives forever. Mark caught up to us quick, breathing hard, still holding his daughter. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the guy. The guy glanced at him, then back at me, and suddenly his whole posture changed. He got aggressive, said something about how we shouldn't be walking around his hunting spot, said we were scaring off his game, said he'd find us in town. At that point, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from trying to keep myself from doing something I'd regret. We had his dumb face, his stupid words, and the fact that he had no idea what he was doing with a gun. But what kept me in check was the kid, Mark's daughter, and I noticed the guy had a kid too, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on a fold-out camp chair under a tree nearby, silent, just watching. Mark finally stepped in between us, just enough to create a buffer. He didn't say anything loud, just enough to remind me that this wasn't the time or place. I nodded, unclipped my holster without drawing anything, and turned to walk away. The guy stood there as we left, still muttering things under his breath. But he didn't follow. We walked fast, sticking to the road and keeping our heads on a swivel. Every rustle in the trees made me twitch. Every time a branch cracked, my pulse spiked. Took us 20 minutes to get back to camp, but it felt like an hour. When we finally saw the tents again through the trees, it felt like stepping into safety. Even the dogs ran ahead like they knew we were out of danger. Back at camp, we told the others everything. Everyone was angry. Some wanted to drive back up there and confront him. One guy even grabbed his own rifle, but cooler heads prevailed. We decided instead to call the local forest ranger office. Cell signal was spotty, but one of us got enough bars to make the call. They took it seriously, sent someone out later that day. We gave them everything: description, location, direction we were walking, even described the kid. I don't know if they caught the guy or just scared him off, but we never saw him again that weekend. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening to every crack and snap outside. Every time the fire popped, I jolted. I kept thinking about how close that bullet came. A few inches to the left or right, and I might not be here writing this. The scariest part wasn't the sound or the gun or the argument. It was the randomness of it. How easy it is for something completely out of your control to change your life in a second. We weren't doing anything wrong. We weren't sneaking through someone's backyard. We were walking on public land, scouting like we always do, and someone nearly killed us for it. I've been in the woods a long time. I've dealt with bears, gotten lost in the snow, even had to pull ticks out of places I don't want to name. But nothing's shaken me like that moment on the road. Hearing that round scream past me and realizing someone just blindly fired into the forest without a single thought about who might be there. I still go out, still hunt, still camp. But now I wear orange even in the off-season. I keep my head up more. And I never assume people out there know what they're doing with a gun. Because that day could have ended with a funeral. Instead, it just ended with a story. A damn close one. And that's close enough. It's been over 10 years now, and I still think about that camping trip more often than I'd like to admit. It wasn't anything that started off strange or suspicious. Just one of those trips you say yes to because you want to get out of town, maybe clear your head, breathe some real air for once. I didn't know it would end with me lying awake the entire night gripping a loaded pistol and wondering if I was about to die because some guy I barely knew decided to flip a switch and lose his mind in the woods. The plan was simple. My girlfriend at the time, Mira, and I had been invited by a friend of mine, Jordan, who I'd known since college. Solid guy, dependable, always down for an outdoor trip. He was the kind of guy who always over-prepared. Brought extra water filters, multiple knives, backup lighters, duct tape. The works. You always feel safer on a trip when someone like Jordan is coming. Jordan had a new group of friends he'd been hanging with, mostly people from his new job. He had moved to another city, and while we kept in touch regularly, this was the first time he was blending his new friends with his old ones. I didn't mind. I'm not the most social guy, but I'm not rude either. I figured worst case scenario, I'd just keep to myself when needed. Camping's not a place where you have to make small talk all day. Mostly it's hiking, setting up, eating, sleeping, and being quiet, which is what I like about it. There were supposed to be 5 of us. Me, Mira, Jordan, and 2 of his new friends. Eric and this other guy named Landon. I hadn't met either of them before, but I knew from texts and calls that Landon was a bit of an oddball. Jordan had mentioned once that he was smart but kind of paranoid, said weird stuff sometimes, but meant well. I figured he was just a little socially off. Maybe one of those guys who talks about prepping or thinks fluoride is brain control, stuff like that. We all met up at a gas station outside of town, loaded up on ice and snacks, and then caravanned out to the site. It was in a state park maybe 2 hours from where we lived. Quiet, not super remote, but deep enough into the woods that you wouldn't hear cars or cell phones or anything mechanical. The kind of place where once you step out of your truck, it's nothing but leaves, bugs, and birds. Trees so thick they dim the light even at noon. We hiked in maybe 1.5 miles from the lot. Not far, but enough that you had to commit. By the time we reached the campsite Jordan had picked, the sun was dropping behind the trees. We rushed to set up before dark, 3 tents. One for Mira and me, one for Jordan and Eric, and one for Landon and whoever he was supposed to bunk with. That's where the trouble started. We were hammering stakes into the ground when Landon suddenly got real serious and told us he wasn't going to share a tent. I hadn't even spoken a full sentence to the guy yet when he just said, loud and flat, that he doesn't sleep around other people because he sleepwalks. Claimed he's done it since he was a kid. I didn't care if it was true or not, whatever the reason, he made it non-negotiable. Pissed me off, honestly. The gear plan had already been figured out. Mira and I were going to have our tent, and Jordan was bunking with Landon. Now he's basically saying screw the plan. Mira and I weren't going to let a girl and two guys cram into a two-person tent, so I ended up sharing with Eric, a dude I had literally just met, and Jordan got stuck with Landon again separately. Whatever. I let it go. I didn't want to argue on the first night and ruin the weekend. We were all here already. The tents were up. The fire was going. The air smelled like pine and smoke. I figured I'd sleep it off, and maybe by the next morning it wouldn't seem like a big deal. That night we sat around the fire eating those foil packet dinners, the kind where you wrap everything in aluminum, meat, potatoes, onions, and throw it into the coals. Beer in hand, stomach full, no phones. It was peaceful. I remember thinking how quiet it was. The good kind of quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. It wasn't until around 2 or 3 in the morning that Mira woke me up. I had barely fallen asleep. The air was cold and still, and my feet were a little damp from condensation in the tent. She touched my arm and whispered that Landon was freaking her out. At first, I thought she was dreaming, but then I heard it too. The sound of slow footsteps crunching leaves in circles, not far outside the tent. I sat up and unzipped the flap just a bit to peek out. There he was, Landon, walking in slow, wide circles around the fire pit, barefoot, shirtless, arms dangling by his sides like he was possessed, just pacing, around and around. No light,
No flashlight.
no shoes, just mindless circles. His head was tilted slightly upward like he was looking at the sky or something above the trees. I whispered to Mira that he said he sleepwalks and we should probably just keep an eye on him to make sure he doesn't hurt himself or wander off. That was my first mistake, thinking it was harmless. After about half a minute of that creepy pacing, he suddenly stopped, just stood still. Then, out of nowhere, he screamed, "Hello!" loud enough that the woods threw it back at us in echoes. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Not the word itself, just the way he said it. Like he was terrified and calling for help, but also like he wasn't expecting a reply. He waited maybe 5 seconds, then screamed it again. Same volume, same pitch. "Hello?" Just like that. Again and again. That was when everyone else started waking up. I heard Jordan unzipping his tent. Eric was sitting up in ours, whispering, "What the hell's going on?" Mira was curled up next to me, shaking slightly. Then, Landon turned toward the woods, off the trail, into the deeper part of the forest, and screamed again, "Hello!" But this time he lifted his right arm and pointed a pistol into the trees. I froze. None of us knew he brought a gun. Not one of us. He didn't wave it or shoot it, he just pointed it. Arm extended like he was trying to aim into pitch black. You could barely see his silhouette in the firelight. It was so dark you couldn't even see more than 10 feet past the tree line, and he was pointing into that like he saw something. I reached under my sleeping pad and pulled out my handgun from my pack. I had brought it for bare safety, and it stayed locked all day. I wasn't planning to use it unless something serious happened, and this counted. I didn't point it or anything. I just kept it in my hand, safety on, and stayed low. The last thing I wanted was to startle him and get him shooting in all directions. But then, just like that, he lowered the gun, walked back to his tent without saying a word, laid down and zipped it up. Gone. Like flipping a switch. Quiet again. I didn't sleep at all after that. None of us did. The next morning, we all acted like zombies. I didn't even know how to bring it up. Eventually, over burnt coffee and dry oatmeal, I asked Landon what the hell that was about. He said he wasn't sleepwalking. He thought he had heard coyotes near the tree line and went out to check. Said he didn't want to wake anyone up because he didn't want to cause a scene. I didn't say it out loud, but I was thinking, asterisk, you screamed into the woods with a pistol drawn in the middle of the night. You think that's not a scene? Asterisk. We packed up and hiked back in silence. Nobody said much. Even Jordan, the usual chatterbox, barely spoke. Mira refused to ever camp again after that. And I never once spoke to Landon again either. But that wasn't the end. A few years later, I was watching the news. I was half asleep on the couch when the anchor started talking about a camping incident. Said a man had been arrested after running through a public campground at night with a loaded gun, firing shots into the woods and shouting about Bigfoot. I sat up immediately. It was Landon. Same guy, mugshot and everything. Said he saw something moving on 2 legs and thought it was a cryptid. He fired 6 rounds into the dark before park rangers tackled him and found he'd been drinking and possibly using something else. The whole campground was evacuated. Kids crying, parents panicking, tents abandoned. They charged him with reckless endangerment and discharging a weapon in a state park. Last I heard, he got probation and a suspended sentence. Still had his gun rights somehow. I think about that trip sometimes when I'm hiking or setting up camp. I think about how if he had fired in the wrong direction, if he had panicked or misheard a sound, someone might have died that night. Maybe me, maybe Mira, maybe a stranger on a later trip. And every time I think about it, I go back to that single moment. That first quiet night, the fire popping low, the circle of light just barely holding back the dark, and that guy standing barefoot in the cold, whispering to something only he could see. That was the last time I ever camped with someone I didn't fully trust. Because one person like that in your group, just one, is enough to make the woods more dangerous than anything that might be living in them. When I was about 7 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip that I still remember vividly to this day. It wasn't one of those fancy campgrounds with neat cabins or flush toilets. No, this was a pretty simple site deep in the woods, somewhere we could really feel alone. My parents wanted us to have that experience of sleeping in the wild, with nothing but tents, campfires, and the sounds of nature around us. The tent we had was one of those family tents with 2 distinct parts. The sleeping area and then a sort of open middle space between the sleeping area and the outside. The middle area was like a porch but inside the tent, a small green mat where we could sit or stash our stuff. I remember it felt cozy but also just a bit strange, like there was an invisible barrier between the actual sleeping space and that open middle room. The tent's doors zipped shut tightly, but that middle space was open to the rest of the tents inside. That night, I was tucked in my sleeping bag, lying next to my 10-year-old brother, and my parents were nearby. The night was quiet at first, the air cool but not cold. The smell of pine and damp earth mixed with the faint smoke from the dying campfire. I felt safe in my little cocoon, hearing the usual sounds, the distant rustle of leaves, a lone owl hooting somewhere far away, the occasional crackle of a branch breaking underfoot. We'd all been told to be quiet after 10 p.m. The campground had a curfew, and I thought it was a good rule. But the calmness of the night didn't last. Around 1 a.m., well past the campsite curfew, the stillness shattered. I was half asleep when I heard voices outside. At first, it was just mumbling, then louder. I sat up a bit and tried to listen, but the sound was strange, too loud, rough, and messy. It wasn't the gentle talking of other campers or the soft laughter I expected. It was wild, drunk, and aggressive. I glanced at my parents, who were both awake now, sitting quietly, alert. The voices belonged to a group of men. They were older, maybe in their late 20s or early 30s, and they were clearly drunk. Their shouting echoed between the trees, loud and slurred, the kind of noise that instantly makes you feel uneasy. At first, they stayed near the fire pit a little way from us, but then I heard the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. A sharp crash made me flinch. I looked through a small gap in the tent's fabric and saw 3 of these men standing around the shattered remains of a beer bottle on the ground. The broken glass caught the firelight and glinted dangerously. I felt my heart start to beat faster. Something about it felt wrong. One of the men looked like he was starting to get angry, maybe from falling too deep into whatever they'd been drinking. I saw him reach down, grab a piece of broken glass, and then he moved towards our tent. My dad must have noticed too, because before I could even think, I saw him unzip the tent's middle barrier. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I could tell my dad was ready to protect us. The man pushed the flap of the tent open and stepped inside, staggering a little from the alcohol. My dad swung out his arm, trying to catch the guy off guard. The man tried to dodge but tripped on the edge of the tent space and fell forward face first into the dirt. I couldn't help but laugh. I was 7, and the sight of a drunken man falling flat on his face was kind of funny. My brother laughed too, louder than me, and for a moment the tension broke. But my mom's face was frozen, her eyes wide with shock. She wasn't laughing. She was scared. The man on the ground was groaning, trying to get up but clearly disoriented. The other 2 men outside the tent started shouting and stomping towards us. I heard my dad warn them, his voice firm but calm. The men seemed to hesitate and then backed off, their yelling fading as they moved away. For what felt like forever, we all stayed silent, waiting, watching the shadows outside. Eventually, the men left the campsite, still shouting and stumbling, disappearing into the dark woods. My parents stayed up the rest of the night, checking the tent, making sure the area was safe. They told us we were okay, but I could see the worry in their eyes. The next day, at breakfast, the campground manager came by. He said those men were known troublemakers, and the police had been called. They made sure to patrol the area later that day to keep everyone safe. That trip ended early. My parents packed up quickly, and we left the woods behind, going back home where I felt safe again. Even now, years later, I remember that night vividly. The mix of fear and laughter, the way my dad stood strong, and the way my family came together when things got scary. I learned something important that night. Sometimes danger is real and close, but facing it with calm and courage, especially when your family has your back, makes all the difference. It wasn't a ghost story or some fairy tale. It was real life, messy and frightening, but it ended because we stood together and didn't let fear take over. That camping trip taught me about how quickly things can change and how important it is to stay alert, even in places you think are safe. I never forgot the sound of glass breaking, the feel of cold dirt under my dad's hands as he helped keep us safe, or the way my brother and I laughed, even though we were scared. And every time I go camping now, I remember that night, the night when strangers crossed the line and my family faced it head on. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I thought we were invincible. We were deep into off-roading, camping, hiking, anything that kept us out in the wild. None of us were what you'd call survivalists, but we were far from clueless. A few of us had grown up hiking with our dads. Some of us did scouts. I had been going up into the Rockies since I was 10. We all had good gear, solid trucks, and just enough knowledge to make us a little too confident. That fall, we planned a trip to a remote spot up in the mountains of Colorado. One of my buddies, Logan, had found this spot online, some old off-roading forum where people posted GPS coordinates for campsites that were hidden gems. This one sounded perfect, 30 miles up a rough road that climbed into a box canyon deep in national forest land. The post was a few years old, but Logan double-checked on satellite view. The road still existed. You could see a little clearing at the end of it. No buildings, no fences, no signs of anything around. We got together over a weekend in mid-October. The trees were already thinning out, but we figured if we went a little lower in elevation, we'd stay above the snow line. The weather forecast was cold at night but clear. Perfect conditions. There were 5 of us, me, Logan, Tyler, Sam, and Nick. All of us had been camping together before. We were used to remote spots, and this one was about as remote as it got. Getting to the trailhead took longer than we thought. The main road was fine, but the off-road section was brutal. Deep sand pits, loose rock, narrow switchbacks with nothing but air on one side, and boulders that scraped even our lifted trucks. More than once we had to get out, walk the trail ahead, move rocks, and spot each other around tight corners. None of us were in a rush. Part of the fun was just getting there. It took us nearly the whole day to make those 30 miles. One thing we all noticed early on: the road looked untouched. No tire tracks in the sand, no crushed grass on the shoulders, no fire rings, no trash, nothing. It was like no one had been down it in months, which was weird. Colorado is packed with campers and off-roaders year-round. A trail like this, beautiful views, difficult but doable, should have shown some signs of life. Still, we didn't think too much of it. Maybe the gate had been closed for a while. Maybe a landslide scared people off. The more remote, the better. We finally made it to the clearing around 5 p.m. It was exactly how Logan described it. Flat, shaded by some tall pines, right up against a massive cliff face that curved around in a horseshoe, nature's cul-de-sac. You could almost stand in the middle and turn 360 degrees, and the only break in the cliff wall was the dirt road we came in on. We got to work fast. Tents went up. Firewood was gathered. Tyler and Nick set up the cooking gear. I walked to the edge of the trees and took a leak, looking up at that massive wall of rock. It really did box us in. There was no way out other than the road.
No trails. No claims.
Just vertical granite and silence. No cell service, of course. Not even a flicker. We expected that. I turned my phone off right then and there to save battery. Everyone else did too. That night we had dinner around the fire, hot dogs, chips, beans. The usual. Once the sun went down, it got cold fast. Probably dipped into the high 30s. We all layered up. Someone passed around a flask. Then we started our usual game, capture the flag. Every camping trip we played. 2 teams, 1 flag each, base camps on opposite sides. Pitch black, just the stars and maybe some moonlight to go on. It always ended with someone getting scratched up on branches or losing a shoe in the brush. But it was tradition. We started just after 8 p.m. First round went quick. Sam got caught running back to base. We switched sides and reset. The second round was longer. I was on a team with Logan. We figured we'd use the road as a shortcut. Curved slightly around the edge of the canyon, and we thought we could get to the flag without crawling through the brush. We were walking along, heads on a swivel, whispering strategies when we saw it. At first, it was just a faint glow ahead, like a flashlight through fog. Then it started moving toward us, unsteady, bobbing slightly. Logan thought it was one of the others using a phone as a light, but it didn't make sense. We were the only ones on the road. As it got closer, we realized it was a person. A woman, young, maybe our age or a little older. She was wearing jeans, a light sweater, and had her phone held up high, like she was looking for signal. She didn't seem drunk, but she was stumbling, rushing, crying. We didn't know what to do. We weren't used to strangers being out here, especially not someone alone. She didn't look up, didn't acknowledge us, just walked right past like we didn't exist. Tears on her face, hands shaking, eyes glued to her screen like she was trying to get a bar of signal that would never come. We froze. Both of us turned to look at her as she passed. Still crying, still walking. She rounded a bend in the road and vanished into the trees. We stood there for a few seconds, not saying a word. I kept waiting to hear a voice behind us. Someone calling for her, a group of friends, a boyfriend, anything. But the forest was dead silent. We jogged back to camp, told the others what we saw. Everyone got quiet. No one laughed. No one cracked a joke. We were all creeped out. More than creeped out, we were uneasy in a way none of us had ever felt on a trip. We agreed to stay in camp for the rest of the night, built up the fire, ate some more food. Everyone had their headlamps on, scanning the trees. No one wanted to say it out loud, but it didn't make sense. If she was camping nearby, we would have seen a car. If she was hiking, where was her gear? And how the hell did she get into the canyon? The only way in was the road we drove in on, and we hadn't passed a single car, person, or track the whole day. We set up a night watch, though no one admitted it was out of fear. Tyler and I took the first shift. We sat by the fire with our lights off, listening. You'd think the forest would be alive with sounds, but it was dead quiet.
No bugs.
No owls, just the wind in the pines. Nothing happened that night. At sunrise, we were up, eating fast, getting ready. We had a plan. Follow the road all the way down to the end of the box canyon. Maybe there was another camp or a trail we missed. Then, if we didn't find her, we'd drive the full 30 miles back to the entrance and check for parked cars or other people. We walked the road to the end of the canyon. It wasn't long, maybe a mile or 2, but there was nothing.
No tents.
No fire rings. No tracks.
No trash. No boot prints.
The road literally ended at a wall of rock.
No fork.
No trail, just a turnaround spot for vehicles. We looked around for over an hour, checked the trees, walked the perimeter. It was like she vanished. We went back, broke camp, and loaded up. The drive out felt different. Every turn, every rock felt sharper. Everyone was on edge. No music, no jokes, just quiet. By the time we reached the paved road, it was late afternoon. We stopped at a gas station in the nearest town, hoping someone had reported a missing person or something, but there was nothing posted. We didn't know what to do. We thought about calling the sheriff's department, but we didn't even have a name. What would we say? We saw a crying woman in the woods and then she disappeared? We hadn't taken a photo, hadn't followed her, hadn't done anything. We went home. In the weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I checked the local news every day. Nothing. I called the ranger station that managed that area. They hadn't heard of anything. No reports.
No rescues.
No open cases. They said that road had been open all summer but wasn't patrolled often. A few months later, I went back on my own. It was still bugging me. I needed closure. I told my parents I was going on a photo trip. Took the same truck. Drove the same road. This time there was snow in the shaded areas. I went slow, scanned every turnout, looked for any sign that she might have come in some other way. There wasn't one. The cliffs at the back of the canyon were sheer. I walked up to them, straight down drops, no ropes,
No cracks.
no trails. You'd need a full climbing rig to get up or down. And even then, you'd need a crew. I left that second trip with no answers, just more questions. Now, years later, I still think about her. I've told the story a few times, usually around fires, usually late at night. And every time I do, someone always says the same thing. Maybe she came in another way, but there was no other way. She wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a hallucination. She was real. Her jeans were dirty. Her hands were shaking. Her eyes were red. She had a phone. She cried. She passed us. And I think the part that haunts me the most is this. She wasn't looking for us. She wasn't looking for help. She wasn't screaming or waving or calling. I've never gone camping. Not once. Not even a school trip. Not with friends. Not even in someone's backyard with a tent for fun. It's not because I don't like nature. I actually love being outdoors, the trees, the fresh air, the quiet. I hike. I swim in lakes. I walk through trails alone. But camping, that's where I draw the line. And the reason is simple. It's my mom. She never let me or my siblings ever go. Growing up, it was one of those unspoken house rules. Like not slamming doors or not leaving your shoes on the stairs. You just knew not to ask about camping. Anytime it came up, like when my friends invited me or when school tried to organize a trip, Mom's answer was a hard no. She didn't explain. She didn't argue. Just no. It wasn't until I was maybe 19 or 20 that she finally told me why. And even then, she didn't tell me like it was a ghost story or something to scare me. She told it straight, quiet, and serious. Like something she'd buried for a long time but couldn't carry anymore. That was the only time I ever saw my mom look nervous talking about something. And after I heard it, I understood completely. She told me it happened in the summer of 1986. She was 16. Her and a small group of her friends, 5 of them in total, decided they were going to go on their first real camping trip. None of them really knew what they were doing, but they were young and thought it would be fun. Mostly, they just wanted to get away from their parents and drink without worrying about anyone catching them. The plan was simple. One of the girls, Danny, had a cousin who worked for the Forest Service and had told her about a small clearing way back in the woods somewhere outside of town. It was on state-owned land, but not a maintained campsite. No outhouses, no fire pits, no signs. Just a flat, open patch way off the road that people sometimes used. Her cousin had said no one goes there except maybe a hunter or two in the fall. It was June. They figured they'd be totally alone. They drove out there in 2 cars, bringing tents, beer, snacks, a couple coolers, and sleeping bags. My mom said they didn't even bring real camping gear. They didn't think about things like flashlights, first aid, or food that wasn't chips or hot dogs. They were just kids, really. They didn't know anything about the woods, and they thought being far away meant they were being smart, that no one would find them, no one would tell their parents, and they could just be wild for a few days. The drive into the woods was already sketchy. The road was narrow and overgrown, more like a trail. Tree branches scratched the sides of the car. Eventually, they had to stop and carry their stuff by foot about a quarter mile. My mom said the path curved and dipped downhill, and it was hard to see behind them after a while. The trees got thick fast. The further in they went, the more it felt like they were in a tunnel of green. But then it opened up. The clearing was maybe 50 feet across, maybe more. Just dirt and flattened grass surrounded by tall pine trees and thick brush. It was quiet. No birds, even. Just that kind of thick, still silence that makes your ears feel like they're ringing. My mom said she felt uneasy even then. She remembered wanting to say something but stopped herself because everyone else seemed excited. So she stayed quiet. That's something she told me more than once, that she wished she had said something earlier. They set up 2 tents near the edge of the clearing, facing the middle. One for the girls, one for the guys. Built a little fire pit in the center and tried to get the fire going. Took a while because they didn't bring fire starters or anything useful. The sun went down while they were messing around. My mom remembered how fast it got dark. 1 minute it was light, and then suddenly it was like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole sky. The trees blocked out most of the moonlight. They had one flashlight between them, and they used it mostly to find their beer. They stayed up drinking and laughing, playing music from a little portable radio. They didn't think about who might be listening. They didn't think about anything, really. Around 1 in the morning, everyone started crashing. My mom said she wasn't tired, not really. She was nervous, but she didn't want to say anything. So she crawled into her sleeping bag and tried to sleep. She was almost asleep when she heard something. It was soft at first. She thought maybe it was an animal. Some twigs cracking, maybe a raccoon or something moving through the brush. But it didn't stop. She lay still and listened. The noise circled the tent slowly, crunching dry leaves and branches underfoot. Heavy steps, not like a squirrel, not like a deer either. She said she didn't want to believe it, but the sound was too slow, too deliberate. Like someone walking. She felt her whole body go cold. She lay there frozen, listening as whatever it was made a full circle around the tent. Then it stopped. She remembered being so scared she couldn't move. Every breath felt like it echoed. Eventually, she reached over and shook one of her friends. Her friend whispered back, "It's probably just animals. Go to sleep." So she tried to believe that. She forced herself to lie still. She kept telling herself it was just the woods. Nothing to be scared of. But her gut said otherwise. She never fell back asleep. She just lay there, staring at the thin wall of the tent, waiting for something to happen. The sun came up eventually. That slow gray light seeped through the fabric. She got out as soon as she felt it was safe. The fire had burned out sometime in the night. The air was damp and cold. Everyone else was groggy, hungover, stretching and yawning, making jokes. But then someone noticed the ground. There were boot prints, big ones. Not just near the fire pit, they were around both tents, deep in the soft dirt. Whoever made them had come in from the woods, walked around their campsite, circled both tents, and left the way they came. The steps weren't rushed. They weren't staggered, just even, steady footprints, like someone was taking their time, watching, listening. They tried to follow the trail, but it disappeared into the underbrush within 10 feet. The ground past the clearing was packed with dead pine needles, and it was impossible to see where the steps led after that. No one said much after that. They packed up fast, didn't even eat breakfast. My mom said she was shaking the entire time, trying to act calm but just wanting to leave. They drove back in silence. No music.
No joking.
No one said anything until they were already on the highway. That night, she cried herself to sleep. Not because something had happened, but because something almost had. That feeling of being watched. That someone stood less than 2 feet away from where she slept. That they didn't make a sound. That they never tried to talk or announce themselves. That they just circled, silently, and left. That would be bad enough. But what made it worse, what really made it stick in her mind all those years, was what she learned afterward. It didn't just happen to them. Over the next couple years, people started talking. Not openly, not in the news, but in small-town whispers. Teens who'd camped deep in the woods talked about waking up to find footprints around their tents. Always at night, always boot prints, always from the woods. Never any sign of who it was. No tire tracks, no parked car, no stolen gear, no missing people, just the prints. Sometimes they were found near trails, sometimes way out in the forest where no one was supposed to be. A few kids even said they saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible before ducking out of sight. No one ever caught anyone. The cops didn't do much. There wasn't anything to go on. No crimes, technically, just weird, silent visits. And then it stopped. After 2 years or so, no one reported it anymore. People forgot, moved on. But my mom never did. She said it didn't feel random. Felt like someone had a pattern. Like someone out there was testing boundaries, seeing how close they could get. She told me she sometimes wonders what would have happened if they'd stayed longer. If they hadn't packed up. If they'd ignored the prints. Would the visitor have come back? Would he have gotten bolder? She doesn't know. And she doesn't want to know. That's why she never camped again. That's why we never did either. I've thought about that story a lot over the years, especially when I'm alone in the woods hiking. Sometimes I stop and just listen, trying to see if I can hear anything over the wind and the birds. I always wonder how close someone could get before I'd notice. How quiet a person can be if they really want to. How long someone could watch without making a sound. People say the woods are peaceful, and maybe they are, but they're also full of shadows, of places where you can't see more than 10 feet ahead, of places where sound doesn't travel the way it should, where a person could be standing behind a tree for hours just watching, and you'd never know. I don't blame my mom for never letting us camp. I think about what she went through that night and the mornings after, and I understand. I wouldn't want my kids sleeping in the middle of nowhere either. Not when you don't know who might be out there. Not when someone could be standing in the dark, just watching you breathe, waiting for you to wake up and see their prints in the dirt. I'll take a trail hike over a tent any day. I like to know I can leave whenever I want, that I can get to a road. When I was around 11 or 12, my family used to go on camping trips every summer. It was kind of our thing. We weren't roughing it in the wilderness or anything. My parents had a small white caravan that had all the basic stuff we needed. 2 fold-down beds, a gas stove, tiny fridge, some cabinets packed with cans, and a tiny toilet that I always hated using. It wasn't luxury, but it wasn't a tent in the middle of nowhere either. It was just right for us. Usually, we would park at those designated camping grounds with electrical hookups, shared bathrooms, and a small shop nearby. My mom liked the comfort of a place with running water and a real toilet, even if it meant shared showers. My dad, on the other hand, loved being close to nature. He'd always try to find a camping ground that was on the edge of a forest, or close to a lake, or just far away from towns in general. I was okay with either as long as I could explore a bit. My sister, who was 2 years older than me, liked to keep to herself more, but she always came along. That summer, we went to a new camping ground near a large pine forest. It wasn't very crowded, just a few other caravans scattered around, most of them parked closer to the shared bathrooms. My dad picked a spot right at the edge of the camping area, not far from the tree line. There was a big flat patch of grass just in front of where he parked the caravan, and the pine trees made a sort of natural wall behind it. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears buzz at night. On our first day there, my sister and I got the idea that we wanted to sleep in our own tent. We had brought a small 2-person tent with us before, but never really used it for sleeping. Mostly it was for keeping extra gear dry or playing in it during the day. But this time we wanted to try staying the night in it. Maybe it was because we were getting older and thought we didn't need to sleep so close to our parents anymore. Or maybe we just wanted to say we did it. I don't know, but my dad didn't object. He set up the tent right in front of the caravan, just a few feet from the steps. It was close enough that we could still see the light from the caravan windows if the curtains were open, and we could even hear if our parents were talking. It was a basic dome tent, maybe 6 feet by 5, just big enough for 2 small air mattresses, a couple sleeping bags, and some small stuff like flashlights and shoes. My dad helped us hammer the pegs into the ground, made sure the rainfly was on properly, and left us with a battery lantern inside. That first evening felt exciting. It wasn't cold, maybe a little cool by the time the sun set, but it was the kind of weather where a hoodie was enough. We played card games in the tent, zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, and tried to act like we were completely independent now. My parents were just a few feet away, but in our heads, it felt like we were out in the wild. I don't remember falling asleep, but I remember waking up. At first, it was just the usual discomfort from camping. The mattress was lumpy, and I had to shift around a few times to get comfortable. I turned onto my side and adjusted the zipper of the sleeping bag near my chin. That's when I heard it. A sound. A soft, slow rubbing sound, like fabric brushing against something. Not loud, not sharp, just weird. I opened my eyes but didn't move. My heart sped up, and my ears suddenly felt more awake than the rest of me. I thought maybe my sister was moving around, but the sound wasn't coming from inside the tent. It was outside, against the wall of the tent right behind my head. Then I heard it again, slow, almost like something was dragging across the tent wall. Not the roof, just the side near the bottom, right where the edge of the tent met the ground. I whispered my sister's name, hoping she was awake too. No answer. I tried again, louder this time, but still nothing. I couldn't see her face in the dark, only the shape of her sleeping bag on the other side. But then she moved slightly, and I knew she was awake too. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was listening. The sound came again, this time on her side. A little quicker, a rub, then a scratch. Not claws, not sharp, just like something brushing or crawling or pushing against the tent wall. It didn't sound like wind. There wasn't any wind. The air was dead still. No rustling trees, no flapping fabric, just that deliberate rubbing sound coming from 2 different sides of the tent. I lay frozen. I didn't want to move. I didn't even want to breathe too loud. My mind immediately went to people. Like maybe someone was sneaking around trying to scare us. Or worse, I thought maybe a person had followed us into the campground. Maybe a thief or some drunk guy or some creep. I know it sounds paranoid, but when you're that age and it's dark and silent outside, your brain fills in every blank with the worst thing it can imagine. Then it stopped. Total silence. I didn't even hear the usual night sounds. No crickets, no leaves, nothing. Just dead quiet. I finally whispered my sister's name again, this time louder, and I heard her shift and say something like, "Did you hear that?" I answered yes, and before I knew it, we both unzipped the door and scrambled out of the tent. We didn't even put on shoes. We ran the few steps to the caravan and started banging on the door. I don't even remember if we were yelling or crying. My dad opened the door right away and pulled us inside. After we calmed down, he grabbed a flashlight and checked the area around the tent. He didn't see anything. No footprints, no animals, no signs of anyone messing around. He told us to try again, that it was probably nothing. My mom made us tea and told us it was just the sounds of nature, but we knew it wasn't. Still, after a while, we agreed to try sleeping in the tent again. It felt kind of embarrassing to give up so fast. We climbed back in, zipped the door, and laid back down. I think it was close to 1 a.m. by then. About 30 minutes later, it happened again. Same sound, same spot, that same slow rub against the side of the tent. It was like someone running their hand or their body slowly along the fabric. Then another rub, then a pause, then again. It wasn't like an animal scratching or clawing. It was too smooth, too careful. We didn't even wait this time. We both jumped out, grabbed our flashlights, and ran to the caravan. That was the end of our tent experiment. We stayed in the caravan for the rest of the trip. My dad checked the area again the next morning and still found nothing unusual. No torn fabric, no droppings, no broken branches nearby. The tent looked fine. The pegs were still in place. The grass around it wasn't even trampled. A few days later, after we had completely given up on sleeping in the tent, my dad finally decided to take it down and pack it away. He started by removing the poles and unzipping all the flaps, and my sister and I were standing nearby, watching him roll up the fabric. That's when he noticed something strange. Right underneath where the tent had been, the grass looked uneven. Not dead or brown, just weirdly disturbed. As he peeled back the tarp and the bottom fabric, we saw shallow dents in the ground, like little dips, almost like trenches. Some were no wider than a hand, and maybe only an inch or two deep. But they ran in short, looping paths across the area where our tent had been. They crisscrossed under where our mattresses had been. One of them ran almost the whole length of the tent's wall, just along the edge. He crouched down and poked at the soil with a stick. It gave way easily, soft and loose, like something had been digging underneath. And then we saw it, a hole. A small hole at one end of one of the tracks, just big enough to fit your hand in. Then another one at the other end. It wasn't just random damage. Something had made a tunnel, maybe a bunch of tunnels, right under where we had been sleeping. That's when it clicked. The sounds, the rubbing, the soft dragging feeling. It wasn't someone outside brushing against the tent. It was something underground, pushing against the fabric from below. The weight of the tent and our bodies must have kept the roof of the tunnels low, and when the animals moved underneath, their backs or bodies rubbed against the nylon floor and the wall edges. We were lying on inflatable mattresses, so we never felt any pressure or vibration. But the sound, soft, slow, unpredictable. That's what kept us up. Later, my dad guessed it was probably moles or voles, maybe a family of them, digging new tunnels during the night. That patch of land was perfect for them. Soft soil, shaded by trees, and not trampled by other campers. The tent was new to them, and they were just continuing their usual paths. It sounds kind of funny now, and we did laugh about it later, but at the time, it scared the hell out of us. We were so sure it was something or someone dangerous. Our imaginations filled in every blank space with fear. The truth was much simpler, but it didn't feel simple in the dark. Even now, I remember that feeling. The way the sound crawled up my spine. The way every part of me stayed frozen, listening. I remember how helpless I felt, knowing my parents were only feet away, but still feeling completely alone. And I remember the way that silence settled in after the sounds stopped, like the night itself was waiting. Since then, I've gone on a lot more camping trips. I've slept in tents deep in the forest, by rivers, even alone a few times. I've heard strange noises, branches cracking, animals. Camping's always been one of my favorite things. I grew up around the woods, spent my childhood summers hiking, fishing, sitting by the fire. There's something about the smell of pine and the crackle of a fire that feels like home. I'm not easily spooked. I've had raccoons steal food 2 feet from me, watched bears from a distance without flinching, and slept through some wild thunderstorms in tents that probably shouldn't have still been standing afterward. But that one trip, a few years back, stuck with me in a way none of the others did. It wasn't anything huge or life-threatening. I wasn't chased by a mountain lion or stalked by a serial killer, thank God. It was small things, subtle, but when you put it all together, it left me shaken in a way I still can't fully explain. And the weird part is, it happened in one of the safest places I've ever camped in. It was a midweek trip in early August. One of those solo, get-out-of-town kind of things. I had a few days off, and my usual camping buddies were busy, so I just packed up and went by myself. I'd been to this provincial park a few times before. It was clean, quiet, and familiar, big enough to feel remote, but organized enough that it still had showers, washrooms, and clearly marked trails. I liked that mix of wild and safe. The site I got that year was on a corner lot, kind of a sweet spot because you didn't have anyone camped directly behind you. Instead, the back edge of the lot butted up to a short trail that led through a strip of woods directly to the comfort station. Most folks didn't use that trail, it wasn't even an official one. It was just a kind of shortcut beaten down over the years by people too lazy to walk the longer road path. I'd used it plenty of times before. It saved maybe 2 or 3 minutes walking each way, and when you're groggy in the middle of the night and your bladder's full, that kind of shortcut feels like gold. The days were uneventful. I spent most of the first full day hiking, reading, and cooking over the fire. The campground was quieter than usual. It was a Tuesday, and midweek always meant fewer families, fewer kids, fewer people in general. I could only hear maybe 3 other sights from where I was. One family a few lots over with a big fifth wheel and 2 kids riding bikes. A solo camper like me down the way with a tent and a kayak, and an older couple who seemed to be spending most of their time inside their trailer playing cards. You kind of get to know your neighbors even if you never say a word. It's part of the rhythm of camping. I went to bed early that night, full stomach, warm from the fire, a bit tired from the hike. The inside of the trailer was cool and dark, and I drifted off easy. It must have been just after 2 a.m. when I woke up. Not from a sound or anything, just that pressure in my gut telling me it was time to go to the bathroom. I groaned, rolled over, and tried to ignore it for a bit, but it only got worse. Eventually I gave in, pulled on a hoodie, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was cold for August, that kind of sharp, silent cold that hits right before dawn. The fire had burned down to nothing but a faint glow, and everything was dark and still. I didn't hear any animals, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just that heavy silence that only happens in places far away from cities. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it toward the edge of the site, where the shortcut started. Now, I could have walked around the road maybe for 5 minutes tops, but the shortcut was right there. I'd taken it dozens of times, probably even at night. It ran straight through a little patch of woods, maybe 50 feet of trees and brush, until it spit you out right under the lights near the comfort station. In the daytime, it felt like nothing. At night, it felt a bit different, but not scary, just dark. I started down the path. My flashlight beam was steady. I kept it low to the ground, scanning for raccoons, porcupines, or even a skunk. Things you'd rather not step on in the dark. I was about halfway through, right at the midpoint where the trees are a little thicker, when I heard it. It was faint, just a light sound, like someone exhaling close to my ear. But it wasn't a breath exactly. It had a pattern to it, a rhythm, almost like giggling. I stopped dead. I turned the flashlight around, did a full circle with the beam, checking every direction, sweeping through the trees. Nothing, not even a twitch of a branch. The sound had come from my left, close, maybe just off the path, but I didn't see anything there. No eye shine, no movement, not even the crunch of a twig. I thought maybe it was a raccoon in the underbrush. They make odd noises sometimes, chittering, cooing, even weird whining sounds when they're fighting or mating. Porcupines are worse, grunting and wheezing like drunk old men, but you usually hear them crashing through leaves or scuffling away when you get close. This was different. It had been so close, but no sound of movement at all. Just that soft giggle. I picked up my pace. My boots crunched on the dirt trail a bit louder now. I kept the flashlight aimed ahead, trying not to think too much. I'd almost convinced myself it was nothing when I heard something else. This time farther off, maybe 20 feet deeper into the trees. A voice. A woman's voice. Not loud, not angry. Just one word. Hello. I stopped again. My heart kicked hard. The flashlight shook a little in my hand. That voice, it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. Too clear, too deliberate. It hadn't come from the trail. Came from the woods. But who the hell would be out there at 2 in the morning, standing off in the trees? I didn't answer. I didn't move. I didn't want to believe what I'd heard. I stood frozen for a second, straining to hear more, but nothing came. Just silence again, heavy and deep. Then I ran. Not a jog, not a power walk. I ran like a kid who just saw something he wasn't supposed to. I clipped my foot on a root or maybe a half-buried log near the trailhead and went down hard. My flashlight flew out of my hand, and I felt my shin tear against something sharp. The pain was immediate, but I didn't stop. I grabbed the flashlight, scrambled to my feet, and ran the last few yards out of the woods to the glow of the comfort station lights. Once I was in the open, I stopped and leaned over, hands on knees, sucking in breath. My leg was stinging. When I looked down, the fabric of my pant leg was torn open and I could see blood starting to seep through. Not a deep cut, but it hurt like hell. I stayed there for a few minutes, pacing around in the light, telling myself I was being stupid, that I'd misheard something, that it was just a raccoon, or maybe even a weird echo of my own breath. Hell, maybe someone from another site had gotten up to pee and was walking around back there. It didn't make sense, but it also didn't mean it was anything to panic about. I used the bathroom, cleaned my cut a little under the sink, and debated going back the same way. My pride wanted to take the shortcut again, just to prove I wasn't scared. But my gut told me no. I walked the long way. The road circled around wide, and as I passed by the spot where the trail connected back to the road, I slowed down and looked into the trees. That's when I heard it again. A whisper, this time clearer, closer, and more deliberate. "Come back." Just like that, soft and slow, like it was right there, just out of sight. I didn't run this time. I just walked fast, really fast. I didn't stop until I was back at my trailer with the door locked and the flashlight turned off. I crawled into bed and pulled the covers up like I was 6 years old again. My leg throbbed, but I barely noticed. I kept thinking about that voice, that whisper. Who the hell whispers "come back" to someone walking by a trail at 2 in the morning? I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked back through the trail in the daylight, checking for signs, footprints, trash, anything. Nothing looked out of place. No weird tracks, no broken branches, no sign that anyone else had been back there at all. The woods were still, normal, quiet, like the night before never happened. Later, I talked myself into believing I must have just misheard something. Maybe a mix of wind and half-sleep had made me think I heard words. Maybe it was a raccoon screeching in a weird tone. Maybe I was just overtired. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I never really believed it. I still camp, still hike, still spend nights in the woods. But I don't take shortcuts anymore, especially not at night. And I sure as hell don't go into any dark trails when I'm alone. That was the last time I let my comfort zone make decisions for me in the woods. The next season, my family upgraded to a new trailer, one with an indoor bathroom. First thing I said when I saw it was, "Thank God." I never told anyone the full story, not until now. Not because I'm scared of sounding crazy, but because I don't have an explanation. It wasn't a ghost. I don't believe in that. But I do believe there are people, strange, quiet people, who do things for reasons we'll never understand. And some of them might be standing in the woods at night, whispering to no one, or to someone who walks too close. Right after we graduated high school, me and 3 of my closest friends decided to do something wild, something that felt like a rite of passage. We were going to hike a big chunk of the Appalachian Trail, starting from central West Pennsylvania and heading down toward New Jersey. None of us were experts or anything, but we'd all spent time camping and hiking before. Still, nothing really prepares you for how raw the wilderness can get when you're miles away from any kind of shelter or cell signal. We started out early one morning, backpacks loaded with gear, enough food for a few days, and way too much youthful confidence. The air was crisp, the trees tall and dense, and the trail was mostly quiet except for the occasional bird call or rustling of leaves beneath our boots. We were all pumped, joking around, stopping to take pictures, and soaking up the freedom of the wild. But around midday, something strange happened. We were deep into a stretch of the trail where the trees grew thick, and the sunlight barely reached the forest floor. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a man burst out from the bushes just a few feet ahead of us. He was rough-looking, weather-worn, with long, dirty shoulder-length hair that hung in uneven strands across his face. His clothes were a bizarre mix of hiking gear that didn't match at all. Some torn jacket that looked like it belonged to a different climate, ratty pants with patches, and a pair of boots caked in mud. What really caught my attention was the machete tied loosely to his belt. It looked old and well-used, the blade scratched and nicked. His hands were scarred and pockmarked, the kind of skin damage that screams years of hard living outside. Though he looked young, maybe mid-20s, there was something about him that didn't sit right with me immediately. He didn't say much at first, just stood there, staring at us with a strange mix of curiosity and something darker, something harder to put into words. He finally introduced himself as Lone Wolf, claiming he was a thru hiker moving south to north on the Appalachian Trail. But the odd thing was he didn't have a pack. No backpack, no supplies, just that weird, mismatched outfit and the machete. The four of us exchanged uneasy glances. None of us wanted to be rude, but there was an edge to this guy that set off alarm bells. Still, we were 18, brash, and stupid in the best way possible. We thought maybe he was just a lonely guy out there, so we offered him some cigarettes, thinking it would be an easy way to keep things calm. He took the cigarettes and lit one with a shaky hand, smoking slowly as he looked at us. But then I noticed something weird. His gaze kept flicking to Gwen, one of my friends. It wasn't casual either. It was the kind of look that made your skin crawl, intense, lingering, and uncomfortable. He started mumbling strange things to her, almost like he was trying to get a reaction. The rest of us started feeling uneasy, the vibe shifting from, okay, this is weird, to full-on alarm. We didn't wait around to find out what he was about. Without saying much, we picked up our packs and started walking faster, putting distance between us and that man. The forest felt suddenly much bigger, darker. We hoped we wouldn't see him again, but we did. 2 hours later, during a break on a tall, flat rock overlooking a small clearing, we spotted him again. Lone Wolf was there, creeping along the edge of the trail in the thick brush, machete still at his side. The way he moved was too deliberate, too quiet. We froze, watching him disappear back into the trees as soon as he noticed we were looking. That was the moment everything changed. From then on, it was clear he was following us. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just a coincidence, that he was taking the same trail as us by chance. But the pattern was undeniable. Every time we stopped, we heard the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, or caught a glimpse of movement just beyond our sight. Our pace quickened. The carefree energy we'd started with evaporated into tension and dread. We moved faster and faster, pushing ourselves harder, but it was like he was always there, watching, stalking. The sun was setting when we lost sight of him for a while, but that didn't ease our nerves. The forest around us felt alive with unseen eyes. Every little noise, crackling branches, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, made us jump. We found a spot to make camp before night fell completely. It was a small clearing surrounded by thick trees and a shallow stream nearby. We worked fast to set up our tents and gather firewood. The fire felt like a small bubble of safety against the overwhelming darkness beyond the flames. But sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, I caught sounds outside the firelight. The snap of a branch, the soft rustle of leaves. Sometimes it felt like footsteps just beyond the edge of the clearing. The fear built up, knotting in my stomach and making my heart pound so loudly I was sure everyone else could hear it. Halfway through the night, I finally called out, voice shaking, "Hello." The forest went dead quiet. No rustling, no footsteps, just the heavy, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. I pulled out my utility knife, gripping it so tightly my palms were sweaty. My hands shook as I held it ready. One of my friends tried to calm things down by yelling, "We've got a gun." It wasn't true. He pulled out a camping frying pan from his bag and waved it around in the firelight, hoping to scare off whoever was out there. After a few moments, the sounds returned, but this time they were farther away. The crunching of leaves and breaking of twigs slowed and eventually stopped altogether. When dawn finally came, we packed up in silence, eyes constantly scanning the treeline. Later that day, near a ranger station, a ranger approached us. He asked if we'd seen a man matching Lone Wolf's description. We told him everything. Turns out someone nearby had been attacked, beaten badly, and robbed. The sheriff was already looking for the guy. The ranger gave us a ride up a fire trail to get us out of the area, sensing how shaken we were. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of dread, thinking about what might have happened if we hadn't been lucky enough to scare him off. It still haunts me. The wilderness is beautiful, sure, but out there you have to be ready for anything. Not every danger comes from nature. Sometimes it comes from the people you least expect. The whole trip started out with the kind of optimism only 18-year-olds have. We'd been friends since middle school, me, Gwen, Jake, and Marcus. When school ended, we wanted to mark the moment with something big. The Appalachian Trail felt like the perfect challenge. A way to prove we could take on something real, something that mattered. We packed light but smart, or so we thought. Enough water, trail food, tents, sleeping bags, and some basic first aid. We figured we'd hike about 10 to 15 miles a day and camp under the stars each night. We weren't exactly pros, but none of us had any reason to believe we wouldn't make it just fine. The first couple of days were great. The trail was beautiful. Rolling hills, thick forest, clear streams. We laughed, shared stories, and at night, sat around campfires talking about our dreams and plans. It felt like a movie, something out of a book. But by the third day, when we were a solid 20 miles into the trail, the wilderness started showing its teeth. The weather was unpredictable. 1 minute warm sun, the next cold wind and dark clouds looming overhead. The trail got tougher, steeper, rockier. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. That's when we saw him. Lone wolf. He didn't come at us slowly or quietly. He just appeared, bursting out of the underbrush like a ghost or some animal. For a moment, we froze. There was no warning, no chance to prepare. He looked wrong, like he didn't belong there. His clothes were old and dirty, but it was more than that. His whole appearance screamed trouble. The machete hanging from his belt was a chilling detail none of us could ignore. We stood there awkwardly. He introduced himself with a casual lone wolf, which felt more like a warning than a name. His eyes darted nervously but with a sharp edge, like he was sizing us up. We offered him cigarettes because we didn't want to be hostile. We thought maybe he was just a weird loner, a drifter with nothing left to lose. But the way he looked at Gwen was something else entirely. It wasn't normal. It was like he was obsessed with her. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We didn't wait to see what he'd do next. We packed up and walked fast, trying to get away. But he followed. For hours, we heard the sounds of him trailing behind us. Leaves crunching, twigs snapping. We dared not stop. Every time we glanced back, we caught a glimpse of him moving through the trees, always just out of clear sight, but definitely there. Our fun, easy trip turned into a nightmare of fear and adrenaline. When night came, we lit a fire and tried to stay calm, but every noise made us jump. We kept our knives close, eyes scanning the darkness. The moment I called out into the black woods and the noises stopped was the worst feeling. That silence after the threat. It was like the calm before a storm. We faked having a gun with a frying pan to scare him off. Somehow it worked. I hadn't planned on spending the night at the cabin. It was supposed to be a quick trip, a short break from the city, a couple of days in the woods to clear my head. I'd been working nonstop for months, and my brain felt like it was on fire. I wanted to be alone, to disconnect. The cabin was an old family property, something my grandfather had built years ago. It wasn't fancy, but it was sturdy. I'd been there a few times before, always during the day, never overnight. This time I thought I'd stay. Just one night, maybe two. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky as I drove down the narrow dirt road. The forest surrounded the path like a wall of green, thick and dark. The trees were tall, mostly pine and oak, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. The air smelled fresh and damp, with the faint scent of pine needles and moss. The cabin sat in a small clearing, tucked just beyond a bend in the road, almost hidden by the thick brush. It was a simple wooden building, weathered from years of rain and snow, but solid enough. The porch sagged a bit on one side, and the windows were dusty. But I liked it. Felt honest, real. I unloaded my things, a small backpack, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and some food. No cell service out here, and I wanted it that way. The nearest town was miles away. I locked the door behind me and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and smoke from the fireplace. There were cobwebs in the corners and dust on the floorboards, but otherwise it was clean. A heavy wooden table stood in the center of the main room, surrounded by a few mismatched chairs. A rusted stove sat against one wall, and next to it, the old stone fireplace. I set my pack down and opened the windows to let in some fresh air. The late afternoon light spilled through the glass, casting patterns on the floor. Outside, birds chirped softly, and the wind whispered through the trees. The sounds were peaceful, calming. I felt a strange kind of relief to be so far from the noise and lights of the city. After a quick meal of canned beans and crackers, I built a fire in the fireplace. It took longer than I expected. Some of the wood was damp, and the smoke crept back into the room before the flames caught properly. Eventually, the fire roared, filling the cabin with warmth and light. I sat on an old wooden chair, staring into the flames. The quiet was deep here. No cars, no distant sirens, no hum of electricity, just the crackle of the fire and the faint rustling of leaves outside. I wasn't tired yet, so I decided to explore the property. The clearing around the cabin was small but wild. A few old apple trees grew near the edge, their branches gnarled and bare from the coming winter. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a mix of pine needles, fallen leaves, and patches of mud. I walked toward the small stream that ran through the woods nearby, its water dark and cold as it twisted between mossy rocks. The sun dropped lower, and the shadows grew longer. The forest began to take on a different character at dusk. The sounds changed too. Birds quieted down, replaced by the low calls of frogs and insects. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a branch snap, probably a deer or some other animal moving through the underbrush. The air grew cooler, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I headed back to the cabin as the sky faded to a deep navy. The first stars appeared, faint pinpricks of light overhead. I closed the windows and double-checked the locks on the door. Then I settled down near the fire again. My plan was to sleep early. I felt the exhaustion catching up with me. As night deepened, the sounds of the forest became louder, sharper. The wind picked up, making the trees sway and creak. Every now and then, I heard a louder crack, like a branch breaking under weight. It made my skin crawl a little, but I reminded myself it was normal out here. Animals, falling branches, the forest being itself. After an hour or two, the fire burned low. I added some more wood and watched the flames dance, hypnotic and warm. Then I felt it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, heavy steps on the dry leaves just beyond the porch. My heart stopped for a second. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one else lived nearby. The road was barely traveled. The nearest neighbor was at least a mile away through dense woods. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved carefully, pacing back and forth just out of sight. I could hear the faint rustle of underbrush. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to tell myself it was a deer or a wild animal, but the weight of those footsteps sounded too heavy for a deer. They were too slow, too cautious. I reached for my flashlight on the table. The beam cut through the darkness as I stood and moved toward the door. I unlatched the lock quietly and cracked the door open just enough to peek outside. The porch was dark and empty. No sign of anyone. I scanned the trees with the light, but all I saw were shadows and the faint outlines of branches. No figure, no movement. I closed the door and locked it again, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted some branches or something had fallen. I sat back down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt different now, heavier. The darkness seemed thicker, like it was pressing against the windows and walls. I kept the fire going, piling on wood to make the room bright and warm. The night dragged on. I tried to stay awake, telling myself to keep alert. Every creak or snap outside made me jump. At some point, I heard a faint scraping sound against the side of the cabin, like nails or claws dragging slowly along the wooden wall. I froze, staring at the window where the noise came from. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It wasn't fast enough to be a small animal running by. It was deliberate. I felt my stomach twist into knots. Whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know it was there. I grabbed the heavy iron poker that sat by the fireplace. If someone tried to break in, I'd be ready. My mind raced through all the possible explanations. Could it be a hunter? Some stranger lost or drunk? Or worse, someone with bad intentions? The noise stopped abruptly, like it had never been there. I strained to hear anything else, but only the sound of the fire remained. I stayed on edge until dawn, never fully relaxing. The morning light was a relief. I opened the door and stepped outside carefully. Nothing looked disturbed. No footprints in the soft earth. No broken branches or torn bushes. The scraping marks on the wall were faint but real, thin scratches in the wood, like from sharp claws or nails. They hadn't been there the day before. I tried to calm down, telling myself the scratches might be from a bear or some other animal marking territory. But the slow, steady footsteps at night still didn't sit right with me. I decided to pack up and leave. One night was enough. As I gathered my things, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. A small pile of stones arranged in a rough circle. It wasn't there when I arrived. The stones were different sizes, some smooth river rocks, others jagged and sharp. Inside the circle, the dirt was disturbed, as if someone had dug or scratched the ground. I stepped back, uneasy. Whoever had been near the cabin last night had left a mark. A sign, maybe. I didn't want to stick around to find out what it meant. I locked the cabin one last time and started down the road, the weight in my chest not lifting. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the clearing, watching. It was only after I got back home, safe in the city, that I realized the scratches on the cabin wall weren't random. When I showed pictures of them to a local park ranger, he told me that bears sometimes do this kind of marking to warn others. But he also said something else, something I hadn't known. Sometimes humans mimic these marks to keep others away, to warn people to stay off private property, or worse, to scare away strangers. I never went back to that cabin after that night. The forest had been quiet in the daytime, peaceful almost, but the things in the dark had left a mark I couldn't ignore. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's supernatural or unreal. It's what's real. People, animals, the dark, and the unknown out there, waiting just beyond the light. I didn't plan to stay in that cabin alone. Actually, I never planned to go there at all. But life has a way of pushing you into unexpected situations. It was a place I'd heard about from a coworker, an old family cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. They mentioned it once in passing, said it was theirs but unused for years. They said I could use it for a weekend getaway if I wanted some quiet. I was tired and stressed from work, so I said yes, not thinking much about it. When I arrived, it was late afternoon in early October. The leaves were just starting to turn, orange and red and gold, making the dirt road to the cabin look like a colorful tunnel. I drove my old sedan slowly down the narrow path. The forest was thick and silent except for the crunch of leaves under the tires. No other cars had been here in a while, judging by the dust on the road. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by tall pines and maples. It was a simple, one-story wooden structure, weathered but solid. The porch was sagging a bit, and the windows were dirty. I could see a woodpile stacked by the door and a rusty metal chimney pipe sticking out of the roof. The place smelled faintly of old pine and damp wood. I parked and got out, stretching after the long drive. The quiet was almost total, except for a light breeze shaking the leaves and the distant call of a bird somewhere high in the trees. I grabbed my bag and unlocked the front door with the key my coworker had left me. The door creaked on rusty hinges as I stepped inside. The cabin's interior was dark but clean. Dust coated the furniture, but nothing looked broken. The kitchen was small and basic, with a wood stove, a sink, and a fridge that I wasn't sure still worked. A worn couch faced a small stone fireplace. I found a box of firewood by the back door and stacked it inside near the stove. There were a few cans of food and some dry goods in the cupboards. No running water, the faucet didn't work, and the sink was just a basin with a pipe that looked disconnected. I set my bag down and opened the windows to let in fresh air. The sun was sinking low now, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest outside looked both beautiful and a little menacing in the fading light. I could already feel the loneliness settling in, but I told myself it was good for me. I needed time to think. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the wood stove, which took some effort, but after a few tries I got a steady flame going. I ate some canned beans and bread, then sat near the fire reading a book I'd brought. The quiet was deep. No sounds of traffic, no dogs barking, no planes overhead, just the occasional pop and crackle of the fire and the wind brushing the trees outside. When I finally went to bed, I was tired and fell asleep quickly. The small bedroom was cold but cozy with a thick blanket. I left the windows cracked open just a little, wanting the cool night air. Around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a bad dream or a noise, just a feeling, like something wasn't right. The cabin was completely silent except for the faint whistle of wind outside. I lay still, eyes wide open, listening hard. Then I heard it. A low, slow knocking came from outside the cabin at the front door. Not a loud knock, but deliberate, slow, one knock every 5 seconds. I froze, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch hitting the door, but the knocking was too steady, too deliberate. I waited to hear it again. 1, 2, 3, knock. Then silence. I sat up, my hands shaking a little. I looked out the window toward the porch. The moon was behind a cloud, so I couldn't see much. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks, but I couldn't shake the feeling. After a few minutes, the knocking stopped completely. I didn't hear anything else outside and eventually managed to fall back asleep. When I woke, the cabin was bright with sunlight. I went outside to check the door and porch. Nothing was there. No footprints in the dirt. No signs that anyone had been around. The woodpile was untouched. The door was still locked from the inside, exactly how I'd left it. I walked a little around the clearing. The forest was peaceful again. I figured maybe some animal had been knocking or maybe a branch had fallen and hit the door in a way that sounded like knocking. I tried to put it behind me and went about the day. I made coffee on the stove, boiled water for oatmeal, and explored the small clearing around the cabin. A thin trail led into the woods, barely noticeable, but I was curious. I followed it a bit, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The forest was dense and quiet. Birds chirped, but no other sounds. As afternoon came, I went back to the cabin and decided to take a nap before dinner. Around 4 p.m., I woke to a noise again. This time, it wasn't outside but inside the cabin. I was in the small living room when I heard a faint scraping sound coming from the kitchen. It was soft but clear, like metal scraping wood. I stood still, listening. The sound stopped immediately. I checked the kitchen. Nothing was out of place. The old stove was cold. The cupboards were all shut. I opened and closed a few doors. Nothing moved or seemed disturbed. I tried to shrug it off but couldn't stop feeling uneasy. I sat back down near the window watching the forest. The sunlight filtered through the branches, making everything look golden. Still, the quiet felt heavy. That night, I decided to sleep with the front door locked and the windows closed tight. I put extra firewood on the stove to keep warm. I didn't want to hear any strange noises outside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up again, this time because I heard footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps just outside the cabin. They sounded like someone was pacing back and forth on the porch. I stayed frozen in bed, listening hard. I didn't want to look out the window or open the door. The footsteps continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped. After a long silence, I heard a slow, deliberate scraping again, this time at the back door. It was like someone dragging a piece of metal against the wooden frame. I was scared but stayed quiet. The noise stopped after a minute. I heard nothing more and eventually fell asleep, exhausted. I got up early, my mind racing. I knew someone or something had been around the cabin at night, but who and why? I looked closely at the doors and windows. No broken locks or scratches on the wood. No footprints in the dirt outside, despite the wet ground from last night's rain. It was as if whoever had been there was careful not to leave traces. I decided I needed to leave, but my car was a 20-minute drive down the dirt road. I wasn't sure if I wanted to walk out in daylight or wait till night and risk another visit. While packing my bag, I found something I hadn't noticed before. A small, thin wire looped around the handle of the back door. It was old, rusty, and barely visible unless you looked closely. I pulled it off and examined it. It looked like part of a tripwire or a makeshift alarm system. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here recently and set this up. For what? To keep someone out? Or to warn someone if I tried to leave? My mind started spinning with possibilities. Maybe someone was living nearby watching the cabin. Maybe the forest wasn't as empty as it seemed. I decided to leave immediately. I didn't want to wait any longer. I locked the cabin doors, grabbed my bag, and started walking down the dirt road toward my car. The trees pressed in close, blocking most of the sky. The air smelled damp and cold. The walk was slow and tense. Every sound made me jump. A branch snapping, a bird calling. I kept turning my head, looking for any sign I was being followed. About 10 minutes in, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Not just my own, but another set. Slow, careful steps matching my pace. I stopped and looked back. No one there. I started walking again faster, but the footsteps matched me again. Heart pounding, I broke into a run. I could hear branches snapping behind me now. Someone or something was chasing me. I didn't stop. I ran hard, dodging roots and rocks, trying not to fall. The road curved through the trees, and I could see my car's headlights in the distance. I didn't look back again until I was inside the car, doors locked, engine running. I drove off fast, not looking in the rearview mirror. The headlights behind me disappeared after a minute or two. I called the coworker who owned the cabin. I told them I couldn't stay there and asked if anyone else had been using the place. They said no, that the cabin had been empty for years. After that, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They said they'd send someone to check it out. Later, I learned the area had been used recently by a group of illegal hunters and poachers who operated at night. They set up traps and alarms to keep people away. The knocking and scraping were probably them checking the doors and perimeter. They'd been hiding in the woods nearby and watching the cabin for intruders. I realized how dangerous the situation had been. I had been lucky to get away without any real confrontation. That experience changed how I view the wilderness. It isn't just peaceful nature out there. Sometimes it's The first time I saw the cabin, I wasn't expecting much. It was just a small, wooden structure, hidden deep in the woods, miles away from any road or town. I had rented it for a week to get away from the noise and stress of city life. The idea was simple. No internet, no phone, just silence, trees, and fresh air. I thought it would be peaceful. I was wrong. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was low, making long shadows stretch between the tall pines. The air smelled clean but heavy with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. I parked my car at the edge of a narrow dirt track and walked the last 100 yards to the cabin carrying my bags. The path was uneven and covered with pine needles, and I noticed that there were no footprints except mine. It felt strangely untouched. The cabin looked old but solid. The wood was weathered gray, the roof sagged a little, and the windows were dusty. There was a small porch with a rickety chair and a rusty metal lantern hanging beside the door. No electricity, no phone lines, just a simple locked door. Inside, it was dark and smelled like old wood and something faintly sour. Dust coated the floorboards and the furniture. The cabin was sparse. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bed pushed into the corner. There was a small pile of firewood stacked near the door and a bucket for water. I dropped my bags, unlocked the windows to let in light and fresh air, and started to get settled. I planned to stay there alone for the week. No distractions, no visitors. Just me, the cabin, and the forest. That first night was colder than I expected. I built a fire in the stove and wrapped myself in a blanket. The walls creaked as the wind whispered outside, and every few minutes, I heard the faint snap of twigs or the rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the usual sounds of the forest. I wasn't worried, I was tired from the drive and soon fell asleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. I walked along a narrow trail I found near the back, which led deeper into the woods. The trees were tall and thick, and the ground was soft with moss. Birds sang quietly, and squirrels darted between the branches. Everything looked normal. I walked for about 2 miles, noticing old tire tracks half covered by leaves, a broken fence, and an old rusted metal barrel lying on its side. Nothing unusual, just signs that someone had been here years ago. I didn't expect anyone else to be close by. When I returned to the cabin, the sun was setting. The sky was a deep orange, turning purple. I started a fire again and prepared a simple dinner of canned beans and bread. I sat near the stove, listening to the forest settle into night. Around 10 p.m., as the fire died down, I noticed something strange. There was a faint light moving between the trees. It wasn't steady, more like a flicker, a glow that appeared and disappeared. I got up and went outside, but the light vanished. I stood there for a long time, looking into the dark woods. No animals moved, no sounds except the wind. I thought it might be a flashlight from a hunter or a hiker passing by. I wasn't worried but made a mental note to keep the doors locked. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Near the edge of the porch, someone had scratched letters into the wood of the railing. The letters were faint but clear enough to read, "Go back." I stared at the words, heart pounding. There was no way I had scratched that. I'm careful and I'm not clumsy. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else around. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I looked around for footprints or signs of anyone nearby but found nothing. The forest floor was covered in needles and leaves, and no new prints were visible except mine. I told myself to calm down. Maybe it was old, left by a previous visitor or the owner. Still, the timing was too perfect. I decided to leave the message alone and continued with my day. I explored a little further from the cabin, taking pictures of the trees and an old creek I found. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet. Back at the cabin, I fixed a cup of coffee and tried to relax, but I kept checking the windows. The forest felt heavier now, like it was watching me. That night was worse. I woke up several times to strange sounds, soft footsteps outside, something brushing against the cabin walls. Once, I heard a low thump on the roof. I lay still, heart racing, pretending it was an animal, but the noises went on for hours. At one point, I heard the door handle jiggle. I sat straight up in bed, staring at the door in the dark. It didn't open, but the sound made me jump. I stayed awake the rest of the night, clutching a flashlight and a small pocket knife I had in my bag. Morning brought no relief. I wanted to leave, but the dirt road was slippery with mud from last night's rain. I decided to pack up and drive back as soon as the road dried a little. While packing, I found something else. A small, crudely carved wooden figure, about the size of my hand, hidden under the porch steps. It was shaped like a person but rough and worn. I had not brought it with me, and there was no sign of anyone else. I shoved it into my bag and decided to get out of there fast. I walked to my car, the forest unusually still. The birds were silent, and the air was thick with an uneasy quiet. I glanced back once and thought I saw a shadow moving behind the trees. My heart leapt, but I forced myself to keep walking. The mud made the dirt track slippery, and my car struggled to move up the slope. When I finally got onto the main road, I breathed a sigh of relief. But I wasn't safe yet. On the drive back, I kept seeing things in my peripheral vision. Shapes between the trees, lights flickering like the night before. I tried to tell myself it was tired eyes and shadows playing tricks. When I finally got to a gas station, I stopped and called a friend. I told them I wanted to stay in town for a day or two and wait for the road to dry before returning. That night, in a cheap motel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I kept the lights on and doors locked. I checked the wooden figure in my bag. It looked innocent enough, but I threw it in the trash. The next morning, I went to the police station and told them about the cabin, the message, the noises. They took notes but didn't seem too worried. They said it was probably some local kids messing around or hunters. Still, something didn't sit right. After a few days, I returned to the cabin with a friend who knew the area better. We walked the forest, looking for signs of anyone or anything. We found footprints, not animal but human. They were old, maybe weeks, but definitely not mine. We followed them to an old campsite hidden deep in the trees, where we found trash, broken bottles, and an old tent frame. It looked like someone had been living in the woods near the cabin. That explained the strange noises and the message. Someone didn't want visitors near their camp. We reported this to the local rangers, who agreed to check it out. I never stayed in the cabin again. I learned that some places are best left alone, especially when someone is already there, watching, and wanting privacy in the woods. Even now, when I think about that week, I get chills. It wasn't ghosts or fantasy. It was real, people living off the grid, guarding their spot, and not afraid to scare off strangers. The forest is quiet, but it's never empty. I never expected that a simple weekend in a cabin would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because of something far more real, far more human, and far more dangerous. I'd rented a small cabin deep in the woods about 30 miles from the nearest town. It was late October, and the air had that sharp bite that told you winter was just around the corner. The trees had mostly lost their leaves, the ground covered in a thick carpet of orange, brown, and yellow. The kind of quiet you find in the forest this time of year is something else. It's the kind of silence that presses against your ears, a thick blanket that dulls the sounds of life. Even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. I'd chosen this spot because I needed to disconnect. Work had been brutal for months. Non-stop meetings, emails, pressure. My brain was fried. I wanted nothing but fresh air, a roaring fire, and a couple of days away from people and phones. I packed a backpack with the basics, some food, a sleeping bag, my old camping stove, and a few books. No signal on my phone, but that was part of the plan. The cabin was simple, one room, maybe 300 square feet, built from logs. It had a small wood stove for heat, a bunk bed, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink and a few cupboards. No running water, so I'd brought a few gallons. There was a pile of firewood stacked outside, covered with a tarp. The place looked sturdy, well kept, but it had been clearly empty for a while. I arrived just before sunset. The dirt road leading up was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for a single car. I parked and unloaded my gear, feeling the immediate calm of the place settle into me. The sky was a deep purple, the stars just starting to peek through. I made a fire quickly in the stove, the warmth filling the room, and sat down with a book. The cabin was dark except for the orange glow flickering on the walls and the occasional crackle of the fire. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly. I could hear distant sounds, the snap of a twig here, the hoot of an owl there, but nothing close enough to disturb me. I told myself I was safe here. The first night passed quietly. I slept under a thick blanket, waking briefly when the temperature dropped. The stove kept the cabin warm enough, but I could hear the wind howling outside. When morning came, the light poured in through the small windows, painting the wooden walls golden. I spent the day hiking nearby, exploring the trails around the cabin. The forest was beautiful in a wild, quiet way, with dead leaves crunching underfoot and cold, clear air. I collected some kindling and stacked it by the door, took pictures of the scenery with my old camera, and made a simple lunch on the stove. As the afternoon moved toward evening, I started to notice a small feeling I couldn't shake, a prickling at the back of my neck, like something was watching me. I told myself it was just the solitude getting to me. After all, I hadn't spent this much time alone in years. The silence, the isolation, it was unfamiliar. That night, I made a bigger fire, hoping the warmth would keep the unease away. I sat near the stove, flicking through my book but unable to focus. The wind had picked up, rattling the window frames and making the whole cabin creak. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow, heavy, dragging along the dirt and leaves. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I told myself it was an animal or the wind. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Near the back door, just outside the cabin, were deep, wide footprints pressed into the dirt. They were too large to be mine and not like any animal tracks I'd seen. The shape was almost human, big, flat, and with toes, but the size was off. At least a foot long, maybe bigger. I crouched down, studying them, heart pounding. The prints led away into the woods but didn't come back. I took pictures, trying to keep calm. I convinced myself it was some local prankster or a hunter who had been around. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That day, I didn't leave the cabin much. I kept the fire going and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. I felt silly. The place was so remote. Who else would be here? But the footprints and the noises unsettled me more than I liked to admit. That evening, things took a turn. Just as the sun was setting and the sky grew dark, I heard something pounding against the cabin's walls. At first, it was faint. A dull thud, then louder, like something large hitting the wood with force. I jumped up from my chair and moved toward the window, peeking out into the shadows. Nothing. The pounding continued, slow and heavy, as if someone was trying to break in or send a message. My hands shook as I grabbed a heavy cast iron pan from the kitchen counter, just in case. I moved quietly to the door, looking through the peephole. Nothing but darkness. I didn't want to open it. The pounding stopped suddenly. I waited, heart thumping. Then, from outside, came a low, guttural growl, deep and unnatural. It wasn't like any animal I knew. It was close, right outside the cabin walls. I backed away, sliding down to the floor, clutching the pan. Minutes passed. The silence returned. I stayed awake all night, sitting near the stove, eyes darting to every shadow. Every creak, every whisper of the wind sent my heart racing. At one point, I swore I heard something breathing just outside the door. Morning never felt so good. The next day, I found more signs that someone or something had been around. Branches broken near the windows, scratch marks on the wood, and more giant footprints, some leading right up to the front door. I considered packing up and leaving, but the road back was a long hike. My car was parked miles away, and the forest around me was thick. I needed to stay calm and figure out what was happening. I set traps around the cabin perimeter, simple snares made from cordage and sticks, hoping to catch something or at least make noise if anyone approached. I barricaded the doors with furniture and covered the windows with blankets to block the view inside. Night came again, colder than before. The pounding resumed, harder this time, accompanied by guttural sounds and strange scratches. I sat frozen, heart racing, trying to breathe quietly. The fire was almost out, and I was too scared to move. Then, suddenly, a loud crash. The door shook as if someone tried to force it open. I raised the pan and waited for the worst, but nothing came through. When dawn broke, I was exhausted and terrified. I checked outside and saw the door's wooden frame was splintered, with deep gouges. My barricades had held, but barely. I stayed inside all day, too afraid to move far from the cabin. That night, the pounding turned into something else. Low growls, snarls, and the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by the distant howl of wolves. I realized I was trapped. The isolation I sought had turned into a prison. On the third day, my food was running low. The cold was unbearable despite the fire. My phone had no signal, and I was too afraid to leave the cabin to check. Around noon, I heard a sharp crack in the forest. At first, it sounded like a branch breaking, but then more footsteps, many footsteps, moving fast, running toward the cabin. I dropped my gear and hid behind the stove. A man burst through the door, covered in dirt and leaves. He looked wild, his clothes torn, face scratched and bloody. He collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. His eyes were wild with fear. He didn't say anything, just pointed outside. I followed his gaze and saw, through the window, figures moving among the trees, tall, shadowy, and silent. They didn't look like hunters or locals. Their movements were unnatural, slow but deliberate. The man grabbed my arm, pulling me outside. We ran through the woods, dodging trees and thick brush. Behind us, I heard the heavy footsteps, the low growls, and the pounding. We ran until we couldn't anymore, finally reaching a logging road where a truck was parked. The man flagged it down and the driver let us in. Safe inside the truck, I realized the full scope of what I'd experienced. The footprints, the sounds, the pounding. It wasn't animals and it wasn't ghosts. It was a group of men, feral and desperate, living in the woods and hunting people who stumbled into their territory. They were ruthless and dangerous. The man who helped me had escaped from them after being held captive for weeks. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of the pounding, the growls, and the feeling of being hunted still haunts me. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural, they're all too human. It started as a normal trip. I wanted to get away from the city, the noise, and the endless pressure at work. For a few days, just me and nature.
No distractions.
I found a small cabin to rent in a remote area deep in the woods, far from any town. The kind of place where you don't get cell phone signal, and the only sound is the wind through the trees and the occasional bird. I'd been camping and hiking before, so I figured this would be easy. The cabin was simple. A one-room wooden shack with a small porch, a fireplace, and a bed. It was nothing fancy, but it had all the basics. The owner told me it was isolated, but I didn't mind. That's what I wanted. Peace and quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon after a long drive. The sun was already low, casting long shadows through the trees. The dirt road to the cabin was rough with rocks and potholes. I had to drive slowly. When I finally pulled up, I noticed how quiet everything was. No cars, no people, just the forest. I unpacked my things and started to explore the cabin. The wood smelled old but not rotten. The windows were dusty but intact. There was a small stack of firewood by the door. The fireplace looked like it hadn't been used for a while, but I felt sure it would work fine. I brought in my backpack with supplies: food, water, a lantern, matches, and a knife. The first night passed without anything unusual. I built a fire in the fireplace, cooked some simple food on a small camping stove I brought, and sat by the fire reading a book I brought along. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and the occasional owl hooted somewhere in the distance. I felt relaxed. This was exactly what I needed. The second day, I woke early and went for a hike on a nearby trail. The woods were thick with tall pine trees and underbrush. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. I carried a map and compass, and I marked the cabin's location carefully in my mind and on the map. The forest was beautiful and peaceful. I didn't see any other people. I noticed signs of animals: deer tracks, broken branches, and scattered pine cones. I kept my phone off most of the time, wanting to disconnect completely. As the sun set, I returned to the cabin. This time, the wind was stronger, and the sky was cloudy. I made a fire again and ate dinner. I noticed the air was cooler now. I wrapped myself in a thick blanket and sat by the fire. That night, I heard something different. A faint noise, like footsteps, outside the cabin. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps sounded too heavy, slow, and steady. They circled the cabin once or twice, then stopped. I froze and listened. The wind died down for a moment. The footsteps started again, this time moving away slowly into the forest. I waited a long time, staring into the dark window, but saw nothing. No flashlights, no people, just black trees. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination or an animal. But I couldn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The third day, I stayed mostly inside. I tried to keep busy, reading, cleaning, writing notes. The wind was constant now. I noticed the cabin felt colder, even with the fire going. In the late afternoon, while chopping wood outside, I noticed something odd on the ground near the edge of the clearing. A small pile of stones arranged in a rough circle, with a few sticks standing upright inside the circle. It looked like someone had made a crude marker or signal. I thought it was strange, but didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe previous visitors left it. I knocked it down and scattered the stones. Later, As I prepared dinner, I heard the footsteps again, this time closer. I looked out the window but didn't see anyone. The porch light wasn't strong, but it showed the empty clearing. The forest behind was dark and thick. That night, I tried to sleep with the door locked and my knife close at hand. But the footsteps kept me awake. They circled the cabin, stopped near the window, then retreated. The fourth day, I decided to hike out to the nearest town to get cell signal and check in with someone. I packed light, grabbed my map, and started walking down the dirt road. It was about 5 miles to the main highway. The walk was long but uneventful. I passed through dense woods and a few small clearings. I noticed old tire tracks on the road, not fresh, but recent enough to suggest someone else had driven through recently. At the highway, I found a small gas station and called my office. Everything was fine. I told them I'd be back in a few days. I also bought some extra food and a portable phone charger. When I returned to the cabin around dusk, I felt better. I thought maybe the footsteps were just pranksters or hunters passing by. I was going to stay alert but not let fear control me. That night, something changed. Around midnight, I was awakened by a loud banging on the front door. Hard, repeated knocks that shook the wooden frame. I jumped out of bed and grabbed my flashlight and knife. The knocking continued, heavy and angry. I shined the light through the window and saw nothing but darkness. The wind howled, making the knocking sound louder. I wanted to open the door and see who was there, but something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or just caution. The knocking stopped suddenly. Silence. Then, footsteps retreating fast into the woods. I waited for a long time, listening, but nothing returned. I stayed awake the rest of the night, keeping the fire burning bright. The next morning, I inspected the door. The wooden frame was scratched and dented from the knocks. On the porch, I found a long, thin branch with bark stripped off in places. It looked like it had been used to hit the door. I felt uneasy. Whoever did this knew where I was. They could have waited until I opened the door. The fifth day, I stayed inside all day. I didn't want to hike out again in the dark woods. I kept the fire going and checked all the windows and doors to make sure they were secure. I even pushed some heavy furniture against the door to add extra strength. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was some local troublemakers or hunters passing through, but the area was supposed to be quiet and private. That evening, I prepared to sleep with the door barricaded again. But around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of something heavy smashing against the side window. I grabbed my knife and flashlight and rushed to the window. I could see nothing but shattered glass on the ground and the dark forest beyond. The fire was almost out, and the cold crept in. I put on my coat and boots. I knew I had to get out. I packed quickly, grabbed my backpack, and opened the back door quietly. The back of the cabin faced a steep drop-off into the woods. I hoped I could sneak down the hill and find a way back to the road. The forest was thick and dark. I used my flashlight, but the beam barely cut through the blackness. I could hear my own breath and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I moved fast, trying not to make noise. The cold air burned my lungs. I was scared someone was following me. After about an hour of walking downhill, I heard voices. Low, angry voices. Men talking in whispers but with sharp tones. I ducked behind a tree and tried to stay silent. The voices grew closer. I could hear heavy boots on the ground. I stayed still and quiet, heart pounding. Then, I heard one voice say, "Did you check the cabin? She's gone." Another voice replied, "Yeah, no sign. Maybe she ran." They sounded frustrated. I waited until the voices faded away. Then I ran as fast as I could back up the hill and toward the road. When I reached the dirt road, I started running in the direction of the highway. I didn't stop. It was early morning when I finally reached the highway. A car passed by, and I waved my arms until the driver stopped. I told them what happened and asked to use their phone. The police arrived a few hours later, but when we went back to the cabin, no one was there. No footprints or signs of anyone else. Just broken glass and a few knocked over logs. They searched the area but found no one. They told me that sometimes, in isolated places like this, people looking for privacy or illegal activity can be dangerous. Sometimes they scare off visitors. The cabin owner called me later, shocked by what happened. They said no one else had reported problems before. I never went back. I sold my gear and swore off remote cabins. What I learned was this: isolation can be peaceful, but it can also be dangerous. When no one is around, you are truly alone, and sometimes others don't want you there. I'm glad I got out when I did. It wasn't ghosts or monsters that scared me, it was real people. And that, for me, was worse. It was late October when I decided to spend a few days alone in the woods. I had been working nonstop for months, and I needed a break. Something away from the noise of the city and the constant buzz of people and machines. I wasn't a stranger to camping or cabins. Over the years, I'd been on many trips, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. I was confident in my skills and knowledge of the outdoors. But this trip, I told myself, would be different. Just me, an old cabin I found listed on a small rental site, deep in a remote forest. The place was about a 4-hour drive from my apartment. It was tucked away in a national forest, nowhere near any big towns or even small villages. The GPS stopped working well after the last turnoff, and the road became nothing more than a bumpy dirt track, with rocks and fallen branches everywhere. I drove slowly, watching every inch of the road. I had packed all the essentials: food, water, a small stove, a heavy sleeping bag, first aid kit, extra clothes, batteries, and a few books. I also took a good flashlight and a basic hunting knife just in case. The cabin was everything the listing promised: small and old, but solid. Built mostly from rough logs, with a metal roof and a stone chimney. It had one main room, a tiny kitchen corner, a wood stove, and a small loft where the bed was. No electricity or running water, just a well pump outside and a bucket for water. It was perfect for what I wanted: quiet, away from distractions, with only nature around. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun was already lowering behind the tall pine trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air was crisp and cool, smelling like pine needles, damp earth, and with smoke from a distant fire somewhere else in the woods. I parked my car near the cabin and unloaded my gear. I took some time to walk around the place, checking the windows and doors, making sure everything was in order. The only sounds were the wind rustling the needles and the distant calls of birds. I set up the fire pit outside and gathered some dry wood from around the area. I didn't want to use the cabin's wood stove until night because I wanted to keep things simple for the first evening. After building a decent fire, I cooked a simple meal on a small camping stove I brought. A can of chili heated with some bread, and ate it by the fire. The crackling flames and the quiet of the forest made me feel calm, like I was really away from the world. As night fell, I went inside and lit the oil lamp that was hanging by the door. The cabin filled with a warm yellow light. I stacked some wood for the stove and started a small fire inside. The warmth spread quickly, and I settled into the old wooden chair, feeling the rough grain of the armrests under my fingers. Outside, the wind had picked up. The trees swayed and creaked, their branches scratching against each other like old bones. It was an eerie sound, but not unexpected. I was used to it. I read for a while, the small lamp casting shadows on the walls. Eventually, I felt tired and climbed up into the loft. The mattress was thin, but the sleeping bag was thick enough to keep me warm. I shut my eyes, expecting to drift quickly to sleep, but the forest outside was restless. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the wind and some distant animal calls. But then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. There was a strange noise outside, something low and rhythmic, almost like a heavy footstep or a slow thump on the ground. I froze and listened carefully. The noise stopped. I waited a few minutes, but nothing else came. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer stepping on a fallen log or some branch. But the sound was too heavy and slow for a deer or a small animal. It felt deliberate, like someone or something was moving outside the cabin, just beyond the edge of the firelight. I got out of bed quietly and grabbed my flashlight. I unzipped the sleeping bag and slipped into my boots. The cabin floor creaked under my weight. I moved slowly toward the door and peered outside. The fire pit was just a few steps away, but no fire was burning now. The moon was bright and cast clear shadows on the ground. I shined the flashlight around, focusing on the forest edges and the dirt road leading to the cabin. Nothing moved. No eyes reflected in the beam, no signs of life. The forest was silent again except for the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. I went back inside, locked the door, and checked the windows, making sure the old bolts were secure. Then I grabbed the knife from the table and kept it by my side on the bed. I lay back down, but sleep was hard to find. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the trees, made me tense up. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the forest doing what forests do at night. A few hours later, just before dawn, I heard the noise again. This time it was different. It was sharper and closer, like someone tapping slowly on the wooden wall of the cabin.
Top, top, top.
I sat up immediately, heart pounding. The sound was steady, slow, and deliberate. It didn't stop for a long moment. Then it stopped altogether. I grabbed my flashlight again and shone it at the wall where the tapping had been. There was nothing there. No marks, no scratches, no footprints on the ground nearby. The sun began to rise, painting the sky with soft pinks and blues. I stayed awake the rest of the morning, pacing the cabin and watching outside. I didn't hear or see anything else strange during the day. I spent the next 2 days exploring the nearby woods, collecting firewood, and reading. During daylight, everything seemed peaceful. Birds sang, squirrels moved about, and the forest felt safe. But at night, the noises returned. On the second night, the tapping came again, but this time at the window nearest the bed loft. I woke up to it, frozen, listening as the tapping echoed through the quiet room. I turned on the flashlight and shined it toward the window. Outside, I could see the branches of a tree just a few feet from the glass, moving slightly in the wind. Maybe it was the branches tapping the window. I stood up and pulled the curtain aside. The branches were thin, and they seemed too soft to make the solid tapping sound I had heard. I rubbed my eyes and stepped outside to look closer. The ground was wet with dew, and the forest was calm. I scanned the trees around the cabin but saw nothing unusual. No footprints, no discarded objects. It was as if the sound was coming from nowhere. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise startled me. I kept the knife next to me, and the flashlight charged beside my bed. The third night was worse. Just after midnight, I was woken up by a loud noise, something heavy hitting the door. Not once, but 3 times in quick succession. Boom, boom, boom. My heart raced. I was wide awake instantly, sweating despite the cold air. I grabbed the flashlight and swung it toward the door. Nothing. No one there. I slowly approached, keeping my knife ready. I opened the door cautiously. Outside, the dirt road lay empty.
No footprints, no tiramarks, no animals.
The trees around the cabin were still. I stepped out and looked around, shining my light into the darkness. The wind was calm now. I checked the door. The wooden frame had no damage, no signs of forced entry, just the loud bangs I had heard. I thought maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had knocked something over, but I saw nothing. I locked the door again, went back inside, and sat down by the fire stove, trying to calm my shaking hands. It was clear that something was out there in the woods. Something was trying to scare me, but why? I didn't have any cell signal, so I couldn't call anyone. My car was parked half a mile down the dirt road. I thought about driving back immediately in the daylight, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle this, that I wasn't going to be scared off by noises or the unknown. So I stayed. That morning, after a restless night, I noticed something strange near the fire pit. On the ground, there was a small pile of dirt and leaves arranged carefully, almost like someone had dug up a small hole and then covered it back again. I hadn't done it. I was sure. I looked around for footprints, but the ground was soft and muddied from the previous night's rain. There were some vague shapes, but nothing clear. I checked the perimeter of the cabin carefully. A few feet from the back door, I found faint footprints. They looked like heavy boots, too big for me or any normal hiker. The prints led into the forest and disappeared. I felt a chill. Someone had been close to my cabin, walking around in the dark. That night, I made a decision. I would stay awake as long as I could, keep the fire going, and be ready to defend myself if needed. I stacked a big pile of wood into the stove and lit it, filling the cabin with warmth and light. The fire was my shield. Hours passed slowly. I kept checking the windows, listening for any sound. Then, just as the night was about to end, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, walking around the cabin. This time, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to confront whoever or whatever was out there. The cold air hit me hard. My breath came out in It started as an ordinary trip. I needed a break from everything. Work, the city, noise, and all the demands that piled up like the weight of winter snow. I wanted something quiet, something remote. So, I booked a cabin up in the woods about 5 hours north. It was supposed to be simple. No internet, no phone service, just me and the forest. The drive was long and winding, the last hour turning into narrow dirt roads with trees crowding in on both sides. I remember the way the sunlight filtered through the thick branches, throwing jagged shadows across the windshield. Felt good at first, like getting away from the world for a while. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a small wooden building with a porch that creaked a little when you walked on it. It had a wood stove, a small kitchen, a bunk bed, and a rusty old lantern hanging near the door. The smell inside was that earthy wood scent mixed with a faint trace of dampness, like the forest had pressed itself inside the walls. I unpacked the few things I'd brought. Some clothes, canned food, a little firewood stacked outside, and a couple of books. My plan was simple: spend the day hiking, come back, start a fire, eat something, then read or sleep early. The first day was peaceful. The woods were alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The trees were tall and thick, with patches of moss covering their trunks. I walked a good 5 miles on a rough trail that disappeared and reappeared among the trees. There was a small stream I crossed by stepping on rocks slick with algae. I felt good, tired but satisfied. When I got back, I gathered some dry wood, started the fire, and sat by the stove to warm myself. The first night was quiet. The sounds of the forest felt natural, like a living lullaby. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I used the lantern and read a bit before falling asleep. I remember feeling safe, secure even. That was before the noises started. On the second night, after I'd gone to bed, I woke up to a strange sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a branch scraping against the cabin. But then I heard something heavier, the slow, crunching steps of something moving through the dry leaves. It was steady and slow, as if something was walking around the cabin, pacing back and forth. I froze, listening hard. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but I couldn't get back to sleep right away. I kept imagining all sorts of things, wild animals or worse. In the morning, I looked around the outside of the cabin carefully. There were no obvious signs of animals digging or claw marks on the door or windows. The ground was covered with dry leaves, but I didn't see any fresh footprints or tracks. Still, the feeling that something had been right outside didn't go away. The next day, I decided to hike further into the woods, away from the cabin. The trail was tougher, and I had to scramble over fallen logs and roots that snatched at my boots. I carried a small knife with me just in case. After a few hours, I found a small clearing with a patch of wild berries and sat down to rest. I felt a little calmer out there, away from the cabin that now seemed too quiet in a strange way. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was already low. I collected some wood, started a fire, and cooked a simple meal of canned beans and bread. The sky darkened quickly after sunset. The forest sounds seemed louder now, the night alive with the chirping of crickets and the calls of distant owls. I sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth and light pushing back the darkness. Then I heard it again, the crunching footsteps outside. This time they were louder, closer. I didn't move, I just listened. The sounds circled the cabin slowly, as if whoever or whatever was out there was studying the place, checking all sides. It lasted for maybe 10 minutes before fading away. I stayed awake for hours after that, staring out into the black woods beyond the firelight. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches barely moving. The air was cold and still. I wondered if the sound could have been a bear or some large animal, but it didn't feel like any animal I knew. Bears usually growl or make noises, and their steps are heavy and uneven. These footsteps were slow and measured, almost deliberate. The next day was restless. I barely ate. I stayed close to the cabin, avoiding going far into the woods. I wanted to leave, but I didn't have the energy to pack and drive back immediately. The isolation started getting to me. The forest felt less like a peaceful escape and more like a trap. That afternoon, I noticed something odd near the back of the cabin. There were small pieces of broken branches and crushed leaves scattered on the ground, but only in a narrow path leading to the edge of the trees. It looked like someone or something had dragged their feet, breaking twigs as they walked carefully. I followed the trail a few steps before it disappeared into thick underbrush. The marks were fresh, no older than a day or two. I went inside, locked the door, and checked all the windows. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like the walls weren't enough to protect me from whatever was out there. That night, I was too anxious to sleep. I sat with the lantern and a baseball bat I found in the corner. I watched the dark woods outside the window. Every sound made my heart jump. The crack of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. Then something caught my eye. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible in the fading moonlight, was a figure. Not a person exactly, but a shape, tall, thin, and standing completely still. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette against the shadows. I held my breath. The figure didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, it vanished into the darkness. I spent the rest of the night on edge. Every little noise felt like it was right outside the door. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, I found more signs of someone or something having been there. Scratches on the wooden door frame, shallow but distinct. A few small stones piled neatly on the porch steps. I realized someone had been watching the cabin, maybe for days. I considered leaving right away, but I wanted to understand what was happening before I fled. I took pictures of the scratches and the stones with my phone. No signal, but the camera still worked. I wanted proof, something to explain what I was dealing with. That afternoon, I decided to explore the area around the cabin more carefully, hoping to find clues. I moved slowly, watching the trees, the ground, looking for anything unusual. Then I saw it. A small campsite about a half-mile away, hidden under a thick canopy of branches. There were signs someone had been there recently. A fire pit with cold ashes, a torn plastic bag, a makeshift shelter made from tarps and branches. I felt a mix of relief and worry. Relief because at least it wasn't something wild. Worry because it meant someone else was in the woods, nearby. Someone who might be watching me. I stayed near the edge of the campsite, careful not to disturb anything. I spotted footprints, boot prints, size large, muddied and fresh. The prints led deeper into the forest. That night, the footsteps came again. Louder, more frequent, and closer than ever. The pacing was restless, like whoever was out there was impatient or nervous. I stayed inside, keeping the door locked and bat in hand. I didn't try to look outside. At one point, I heard a scraping sound on the roof. Something was climbing, moving slowly but surely. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I stayed still, trying to control my breathing. Then the sound stopped. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside cautiously. The ground beneath the porch had fresh claw marks. I realized the thing on the roof was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something bigger, but I couldn't be sure. I spent the day packing my things, planning to leave before dark. But before I could get into the car, I heard a noise behind me. I spun around. A man stood there, wearing worn clothes, dirty boots, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't say a word, just stared. I didn't know what to do. He looked rough, someone used to the woods. I slowly backed away, keeping my eyes on him. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. I got into the car and drove off as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station miles away. Later, I reported what happened to the local ranger station. They said the area had a few people who lived off the grid, sometimes trespassing on private property, but usually avoiding contact. They advised me to be careful and stay away from the woods there for a while. Looking back, I think what scared me the most wasn't some ghost or monster. It was the fact that I was completely alone in a place where someone else was watching me. Someone who lived in the shadows and moved like a ghost, but was all too real. The feeling of being hunted, not by wild animals, but by a person who knew the woods better than I did. The cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Instead, it became a lesson. Nature isn't always kind, and sometimes the most dangerous things aren't animals or storms, but the people we don't see until it's too late. I'm not sure why I agreed to go to that cabin alone. I usually prefer camping in a group, especially when it comes to remote places. But something about having my own space for a few days away from the city noise sounded like a good idea. No distractions, no cell service, just me and the woods. I had found the cabin listed on a rental website, isolated, simple, and fairly cheap. The photos showed a small wooden house with a chimney and a porch overlooking a clearing in the forest. It looked perfect for what I wanted, peace and quiet. I packed lightly but with what I thought was enough for a weekend: food, water, some warm clothes, my sleeping bag, and a few books. I didn't bring any fancy gear or weapons. I've been out in the wild before and never felt I needed to carry anything more than a basic knife and some matches. The drive out was long but uneventful. I left the highway early and followed the GPS through winding gravel roads that got narrower the further I went. The trees thickened around me until I was surrounded by nothing but tall pines and oaks. The air smelled fresh and cold, a sharp contrast to the city smog I'd left behind. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin stood, I pulled in and turned off the engine. The place was exactly like the photos, maybe even more rustic than I expected. The wood on the walls was weathered, but the roof looked solid. The porch creaked under my boots as I stepped out. I could hear the wind through the trees, a faint rustling of leaves, and somewhere in the distance, the quiet hum of a small stream. I unloaded my bag and set about getting a fire started. The cabin had a wood stove, which was good because it was already getting chilly. I found some dry wood stacked nearby and some kindling in the shed. After a few failed attempts, I managed to get the stove going, and the warmth quickly filled the room. I spent the first evening reading by the fire, listening to the sounds outside. No cars, no planes, just the occasional bird and the distant howl of a coyote. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright. I felt relaxed in a way I hadn't for months. The first night went fine. I slept well wrapped in my sleeping bag, with the stove warming the small space. The quiet was actually comforting. The next morning, I woke early and decided to explore a little around the cabin. There was a narrow dirt trail that led into the woods, so I followed it for about an hour. The forest was thick but peaceful, with patches of sunlight filtering through the leaves. I didn't see much, just squirrels, some birds, and the usual bugs. I found an old, rusted-out metal barrel a little way down the trail and some broken glass nearby, but no real signs of recent human activity. It looked like the area hadn't been used much in years. That was fine by me. I liked that kind of solitude. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and writing in my notebook. I was careful not to stay out too late because the light faded quickly under the thick canopy. Dinner was simple: canned beans and some bread. Nothing fancy, but filling. Around dusk, I noticed the wind picking up, making the trees sway and creak louder. The sky had turned a dark gray, and I thought rain might come. I checked the stove and stacked more wood before settling in for the night. This second night was when things started to change. I was lying in my sleeping bag, the stove still burning low, when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches scratching against the cabin walls or the roof. But then I heard it again, a distinct scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged over dirt or gravel. My heart rate sped up a little. I wasn't afraid yet, but I was alert. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the sleeping bag, trying not to make too much noise. The cabin was small and dark except for the faint glow of embers in the stove. I turned on the flashlight and shone it through the window toward the porch. The beam swept over the trees and the clearing, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no shadows. The wind howled louder, and the scratching noise stopped. I waited for a while, listening. After a few minutes, I thought maybe it was just an animal, a deer or some other creature moving near the cabin. Nothing else happened, so I relaxed and went back to bed, though I kept the flashlight close. The third day was colder and cloudier. The sky stayed gray all day, and a light drizzle began in the afternoon. I stayed inside mostly, keeping the stove going and trying not to think too much about the noises from the night before. Around evening, the scraping sound came back. Louder this time. It was definitely outside. Started just after the sunset and lasted maybe 10 minutes. I could hear twigs snapping and something moving slowly across the ground. I decided to get up and check again, but when I opened the door, the air was damp and cold. The porch was wet from the drizzle, and the forest was dark and quiet except for the rain tapping on the leaves. I shined the flashlight into the woods but saw nothing. No footprints in the soft dirt or mud. No broken branches. I scanned every direction but came up empty. Still, the feeling that someone or something was nearby wouldn't leave me. I went back inside and locked the door. The cabin had a simple latch and a deadbolt. I made sure both were secure. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every little noise woke me, and I kept thinking about the scratching and dragging sounds. My mind raced through possibilities. Wild animals, hunters, or maybe other people camping nearby. But no one had been visible so far. The fourth day was the worst. When I woke up, the stove had gone out overnight, and the cabin was cold. I went outside to gather wood for the fire, and that's when I noticed something. Near the edge of the clearing, not far from the porch, were footprints. They were large and deep in the muddy ground, definitely human. But the prints looked old, maybe a day or two, and they didn't match any shoes I had. They were boots, heavy, maybe military style. I walked the trail and looked for more signs, but the prints ended abruptly at the edge of the trees. No clear path, no other tracks nearby. The feeling of being watched returned stronger than before. Later that afternoon, I was sitting by the stove when I heard a loud knock on the cabin door. My heart jumped. I wasn't expecting anyone. I froze, listening. Another knock, louder this time. I stood slowly and went to the door, peeking through the small window. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, flashlight in hand, and stepped outside. The clearing was empty. No footprints or signs anyone had just knocked. The rain had stopped, but the ground was still wet. I checked the perimeter carefully but found nothing. That night, I kept the door locked and even wedged a chair against it for extra security. I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to every sound. Around midnight, the knocking came back, soft but steady, like someone tapping with fingers. I didn't answer. I just stayed silent, trying not to breathe too loudly. The knocking stopped after a few minutes. I didn't hear anything else until dawn. By morning, I was exhausted and uneasy. I packed my gear quickly, deciding to leave. Before I left, I took one last look around the cabin and noticed something chilling. On the porch, scratched into the wooden floorboards, were deep marks, like claw or knife scratches, arranged in a pattern. I couldn't understand it at first, but they looked deliberate, not random. The scratches looked fresh, as if made just the night before. I didn't touch them. I grabbed my bag, locked the door, and headed back down the trail. The drive back was tense. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights or a vehicle following me. But the road was empty. I didn't stop until I reached a small town with cell signal. I called the local ranger station and reported what I had experienced. The ranger said the area was known for some illegal activities. Poachers, sometimes trespassers, but there were no reports of anyone missing or harmed lately. They suggested I avoid going back alone and to always let someone know my plans. I haven't gone back to that cabin since. I think about those nights a lot. The strange noises, the footprints, the knocking, and those scratches on the porch. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters, but something was definitely there. Something human but dangerous. And that's the last time I tried to get away from the city in complete solitude. I'd never thought I'd end up in a place like that cabin, out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but the trees, the wind, and a cold, dark sky. But when the chance came to spend a weekend away from the city, to just clear my head and get some fresh air, I jumped on it. I've always liked the outdoors, camping, hiking, being away from noise, but this trip was different from all the others I'd done before. What I thought would be peaceful quickly turned into one of the most nerve-wracking experiences of my life. The cabin was supposed to be rustic, simple, and off the grid. A friend had told me about it. A family cabin up north, away from the usual trails and tourists. It was a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town, and the last hour was on a gravel road so rough that even my SUV struggled. By the time I pulled up, the sun was already dipping low, bleeding through the tall pines that crowded the road. The cabin looked older than I expected. Weather-beaten wood, a tin roof dented and rusted, and a porch that creaked under every step. It wasn't what I'd call cozy, more like rough and basic, but it was exactly what I wanted. Alone, quiet, and disconnected. Inside, there was no electricity, just a small wood stove, a few dusty chairs, a metal table, and a bed with a thin mattress. I had brought a few things: a gas lantern, some canned food, water, a first aid kit, and plenty of firewood. I figured that's all I'd need. No cell service either, that was part of the deal.
No distractions.
After dropping my bags, I got a fire going in the stove. The dry wood caught quickly, filling the small cabin with heat and a smoky smell. Outside, the light was fading fast, and the trees began to blend into the dark. I cooked some beans over the stove, ate quietly, and then sat back, staring into the dancing flames. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but distinct enough to stop me cold. I paused, listening. Nothing from the road, no cars, no people. Just the forest, alive with its usual nighttime noises. Crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But beneath that, something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Came from outside, but it didn't sound like an animal. More like something deliberate, like knocking. I stood up, lantern in hand, and went out onto the porch. The cold night air bit into my skin, and the dark felt thick, almost heavy. I scanned the trees all around the cabin. Nothing, no one, no movement. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it started. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably a branch knocking against the cabin, or maybe a woodpecker. Still, the feeling of being watched settled into the pit of my stomach. I went back inside, locked the door, and closed the windows tight. I spent the rest of the evening trying to read by the fire, but every few minutes, my attention was drawn back outside. The woods felt too quiet, like the usual nighttime sounds were holding their breath. I kept checking the windows, but all I could see were shadows. By midnight, I was ready for bed, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay on the thin mattress, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling, listening. That tapping returned, only louder this time. And not just tapping, faint footsteps, crunching leaves, dragging sounds. But they were always outside the cabin, never moving closer, always stopping and starting again. I forced myself to get up and look out the window. The lantern on the porch was still burning, casting a dim circle of light, but outside that, the forest was a wall of black. I stood there for what felt like forever, eyes straining to catch movement. The sounds stopped abruptly. The only thing left was the wind, cold and sharp. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I fell asleep. But the next morning, the first thing I noticed was the marks on the porch floor. They were deep scratches, jagged and wide, right outside the door. Not like anything an animal would make. The marks looked like someone had dragged something heavy across the wood. I touched them, feeling the splinters. The wood was raw beneath the old paint. I didn't hear any voices, no people or vehicles on the road. The place was isolated. I should have felt safe, but the scratches unsettled me. The rest of the day, I tried to keep busy. I gathered more firewood from the woods, chopping with my small axe, careful not to lose focus. The woods were dense, the trees close, and the underbrush thick with fallen branches and dry leaves. Every crackle made me jump. I kept an eye on the edges of the forest, as if expecting to see someone or something.
Nolak.
That night, the tapping and noises came back, stronger and more frequent. The same rhythm, like someone pacing just beyond the tree line. I tried to tell myself it was a wild animal or the wind playing tricks, but I had been outside long enough to know the sounds of animals in the woods. This wasn't natural. Around 2 a.m., the noises stopped again. I waited in silence, then heard a sharp knock on the cabin door. One knock, slow and deliberate, then silence. I froze, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would burst from my chest. I wanted to ignore it, to tell myself it was a branch or something falling. But the knock was solid, clear. I stayed still, breath held. Nothing else. In the morning, I found another clue. This time, a set of footprints in the dirt just a few feet from the porch. Heavy boots, big and wide, but smeared with mud. I traced the prints with my hand, feeling the cold earth. They came from the edge of the woods and stopped abruptly at the porch steps. No footprints on the porch, no sign that anyone had tried to get inside. I hadn't seen or heard anyone that day, but the footprints proved something or someone was close, closer than I liked. Over the next 2 days, I tried to ignore the feeling of being watched. I kept the fire going, locked the doors, and stayed inside as much as possible. I took short walks during the day, but always with my axe in hand. On the third night, the cabin felt like a trap. The tapping started earlier, right after sunset, and got louder. The footsteps followed, slow and methodical, circling the cabin. Then something new, a scraping sound, like metal dragged across wood, that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. I sat frozen, clutching my axe, waiting for the sound to stop. When it finally did, I got up and peered out through a crack in the window. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and trees. Then, just beyond the porch light, a dark shape moved. It was hunched, large, and carrying something long and thin, maybe a crowbar or a pipe. I snapped back from the window and locked the door tighter. My mind raced. Why would someone come here, alone at night? What did they want? I had no phone signal, no way to call for help, no neighbors nearby. I was trapped. The night stretched out like a long, slow nightmare. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Then, in the dead silence around 3 a.m., the front door rattled. Hard. Someone was trying to get in. I gripped my axe tightly, heart hammering. The door shook again, and then the lock gave way with a snap. The door swung open a few inches. I raised the axe and stepped forward, but no one came inside. The cabin was empty. I stared into the darkness beyond the doorway. Outside, footsteps ran away into the woods. I slammed the door shut and bolted it. For the rest of the night, I barely slept, sitting by the fire with the axe at my side. Morning finally came, and I made a decision. I packed up everything as fast as I could. I didn't want to stay another night. As I drove down the gravel road, the forest closing in on me, I looked back once. No one was there, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. Someone had been watching me, playing a dangerous game. I didn't know why, but I didn't want to find out. The cabin, the scratches, the noises, they weren't supernatural. They were real, and real was scarier than anything else. I never thought a simple weekend trip could turn into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I've always liked the outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, stuff like that. I'm not an expert, but I know how to be careful and prepared. Still, the cabin trip I took a few months ago was something else entirely. I want to tell it exactly as it happened without changing a thing, because there were no ghosts, no monsters, just real fear born from real things. I had been looking forward to this trip for a while. I found the cabin online, some old rental place about 2 hours out of town, deep in the forest. It was a small cabin, rustic but clean, with no electricity and no internet, which was perfect for getting away from everything. I packed my gear the night before. Some canned food, bottled water, a lantern with extra batteries, a first aid kit, a good knife, and a few blankets. I made sure to bring my phone, though the website warned there was no signal out there. Better safe than sorry. I left early Saturday morning, driving out on winding roads lined with tall pine trees. As I got closer, the air seemed to get cooler, and the noise of the highway faded until all I could hear was the wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures. A small wooden building with a porch and a stone chimney. There was a gravel parking area, but no other cars or signs of people around. Just the cabin and the woods. The sun was still high, so I unloaded my gear and took a quick walk around the area. The forest was thick with tall pines and oaks. The ground was soft with pine needles and leaves. The cabin was on a small clearing, maybe half an acre, with a small stream running nearby. The air smelled fresh, like earth and wood smoke. It felt peaceful, but quiet in a way I hadn't noticed before. No distant sounds of cars or planes, just nature. I spent the afternoon unpacking and setting up. The cabin had a small wood stove for heat, a table, 2 chairs, a bed frame with a mattress and some shelves. There was a bucket for water, but no running water inside. Outside, I found a well and a pile of firewood stacked near the porch. I filled my water bottles from the well and got the fire started for the stove. I cooked a simple meal, canned beans heated over the stove, and then settled in with a book. As evening came, the light changed. The sky went from bright blue to soft pink, then dark purple. Shadows grew long across the clearing, and the sounds of the forest shifted. Birds stopped singing, replaced by crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I lit the lantern and sat by the stove, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. Around 9 p.m., I decided to get ready for bed. I stacked some wood in the stove and put on a sweater. Outside, the wind picked up a bit, making the trees sway and creak. I closed the windows and locked the door, then lay down on the mattress with my blankets. It was completely dark inside, except for the faint glow of the lantern. I read for a while, but my eyes grew heavy. I wasn't used to the silence of the woods at night, and my mind started wandering. Then, around 11 p.m., I heard it, the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it might be an animal. Bears? Deer? Or maybe just raccoons are common around here. But these were heavy, slow steps. Too heavy for a raccoon, too slow for a deer. I froze, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped near the porch. Then, something scratched against the wooden siding, slow and steady. It was faint, but definitely deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the table, shined it toward the window, but saw nothing. My mind raced. Maybe someone else was out here? A hunter? A camper? But why would they be creeping around my cabin at night? I thought about calling 911, but my phone had no signal. I was completely alone, trapped in this cabin far from any help. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I tried to stay calm, thinking it might just be an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. But then I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl or a deep hum, coming from just outside the door. I stood up slowly and walked toward the door, gripping my flashlight and knife tightly. The sound stopped. I looked out through the window again. Nothing but the dark forest. I checked the locks, made sure the door was secure. Then I sat back down, trying to calm my breathing. The footsteps started again, this time moving around the cabin, circling slowly, like someone was watching me. I felt trapped. The cabin was small, and there was no escape without going through the woods. I thought about hiding in the corner or trying to wait it out, but the noise didn't stop. Suddenly, a loud bang on the door made me jump. Someone or something was trying to force their way in. I grabbed my knife and got ready to defend myself, but then I remembered there was a window I could try to break to get out the back. I didn't want to stay inside if someone was trying to break in. I ran to the window and tried to open it, but it was stuck. I kicked at it hard, and it cracked but didn't break all the way. The banging on the door continued, stronger now, almost like they were trying to break it down. Panic was rising in my chest. I was alone, no signal, no way out except through that window or the door. Then the banging stopped. Silence. I waited, holding my breath. Suddenly, I heard footsteps running away, fast now, crashing through the brush toward the deeper forest. I sat down on the floor, shaking. After what felt like hours, I forced myself to sleep, keeping the knife close. Morning came slowly. The light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. I was exhausted but relieved the night was over. I stepped outside to see if anything was disturbed. The porch had scratch marks and dirt smeared on the door. I found footprints in the mud, big, heavy boots leading into the forest, but no signs of who they belonged to. I packed up quickly and left, driving back toward town as fast as I could. Later, I learned that the area was known for people who liked to sneak around illegally, poachers or people hiding from the law. Maybe one of them had been watching me or trying to get into the cabin. That trip taught me how dangerous being alone in the wilderness can be, not because of animals or ghosts, but because there are real people with bad intentions. Since then, I always check for signal and bring a GPS tracker, and I don't stay in places where I don't know who might be around. I want to tell you about the scariest night I ever spent at a cabin. It wasn't a ghost story or some fairy tale. It was something real, something that still gives me chills when I think about it, even years later. I don't remember exactly how long it took me to calm down after that night. Maybe a few weeks, maybe more. It was so clear in my head, like a movie playing on repeat. It started when I decided to take a break from everything. The city noise, the stress at work, the never-ending distractions. I found this cabin online, a small place deep in the woods. It wasn't fancy, just a wooden cabin with basic electricity and water, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. No neighbors for miles. Exactly what I wanted. I was going to spend a weekend alone, just me, the trees, and silence. The drive to the cabin was already a hint of what was to come. The GPS stopped working about 10 miles before I got there, and the road narrowed into a dirt path barely wide enough for one car. Tall pine trees lined both sides, and their shadows stretched over the road, even in the daylight. I kept glancing at the sky through the trees. The sun was already low. I figured I'd get there just before dark. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I noticed it looked older than the pictures. The wood was worn, some of the paint peeling off. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped out. I took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill my lungs. No sounds except for the wind through the trees and a few birds chirping far away. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood smoke mixed with a faint smell of damp earth. The windows were covered in thin curtains that barely let any light in. Inside, there was a small kitchen with a wood stove, a table, and a few chairs. A couch sat against one wall, and a small bedroom with a bed and a dresser was at the back. I unpacked my things quickly, wanting to get settled before dark. The sun was almost gone by the time I finished. I started a fire in the stove to warm up the room. Outside, the woods grew darker and more silent. I decided to take a quick walk around the cabin before night fully settled. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The forest felt different now. The sounds I had heard during the day, birds, squirrels, even the wind, all seemed to stop. The trees towered above me, their branches like long fingers reaching down. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, but only for a few feet ahead. Beyond that, it was just black. I walked around the cabin once, noticing the footprints in the dirt nearby. I was the only one who had been here today, so they had to be mine. Still, I paused when I saw fresh tracks that didn't match my shoes. They were larger, deeper, and moved from the edge of the woods toward the back of the cabin. I felt a little uneasy but told myself it was probably an animal. I went back inside, locked the door behind me, and closed all the windows. The cabin felt smaller and colder now that the light was gone. I turned on a small battery lamp, sat on the couch, and tried to relax. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Sometimes it sounded like something heavy was moving just beyond the window. Around midnight, I got up to check the fire. The wood was burning low, so I added more logs. When I looked outside, The woods were pitch black except for the circle of light from my small porch lamp. Then I saw it. A shape, dark and still, standing at the edge of the light. I froze. The figure didn't move or make any sound. It just stared. My heart pounded so loud I was sure it could be heard through the walls. I reached for the flashlight, but my hands shook so badly I dropped it on the floor. The light rolled and then stopped, pointing directly at the figure. The shape was gone. I checked every corner of the cabin, every window, every door. No sign of anyone outside. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the dark. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. For the rest of the night, I stayed near the fire, clutching a knife I found in the kitchen drawer. Every little sound made me jump. The wind howled through the trees, and I swear I heard whispering, but no words I could understand. Morning came slowly, like a relief I hadn't realized I needed. The sun peeked through the trees and lit up the cabin. I opened the door and stepped outside to look around again. No tracks, no footprints, nothing that explained the shape I saw. I stayed outside for a long time, listening to the birds and the rustling leaves. The forest seemed peaceful again. I thought about leaving right then, but something made me stay. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to focus on small tasks, gathering firewood, cleaning the cabin, making a simple meal. But my nerves never fully settled. That night was worse than the first. The noises grew louder, closer. Something was circling the cabin, moving just beyond the trees. I heard branches snapping repeatedly on one side, then footsteps on the other. It was like something was watching me, studying me. At one point, I caught a glimpse of glowing eyes in the dark. Not an animal's, these eyes were too big, too steady. They didn't blink or move like a deer or coyote. They just stared. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, pacing inside the cabin, listening and waiting. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted, shaking, and scared. I decided I couldn't stay another night. But when I went to start the car, it wouldn't turn on. I tried the ignition over and over, but nothing. The battery was dead or something was wrong. I was stuck. I looked around the clearing, hoping to see someone. A neighbor, a hiker, anyone. But the woods stretched in every direction, empty and silent. I went back inside, feeling trapped. I grabbed my phone, but no signal. No way to call for help. Panic started to rise. I sat down and tried to think logically. The cabin was small, but had some food and water. I could wait for someone to come by, or try to walk back to the main road. But I didn't know how far it was. And if whatever was out there was still around, I wasn't sure walking into the woods alone was a good idea. I decided to wait it out until nightfall and try the car again then. The hours dragged by slowly. I kept the fire burning and stayed near the door, knife in hand. When night came, the noises started again. But this time, they weren't just outside. I heard sounds from the attic, footsteps, scratching, something heavy moving above me. The cabin creaked as if the whole place was alive. I knew no one else was supposed to be here. The owner had told me no one else lived nearby. So what was in the attic? I grabbed my flashlight and climbed the narrow stairs to the small attic room. It was dark and dusty, filled with old boxes and cobwebs. But there was no one there. Then I heard a soft thud from behind one of the boxes. I shone the flashlight and saw a hole in the floorboards, broken and rotten. Through the hole, I could see a dark crawl space. The air smelled musty and stale. Suddenly, something moved in the crawl space. A low growl echoed from deep below the floor. I jumped back and slammed the attic door shut. For a moment, I considered leaving everything behind and running out into the woods. But I knew that wouldn't solve anything. I spent the next few hours barricading the attic door and trying to calm down. When the sun finally rose, the noises stopped. The next morning, I found fresh claw marks on the outside of the cabin near the attic window. Something had tried to get in. I packed my things quickly and decided to try the car again. This time, it started. I didn't waste a second. I pulled out of the clearing and drove fast down the dirt road. I didn't look back until I reached the main highway, where the trees finally opened up and the world felt safe again. I've thought about that night so many times since. What was out there in the woods? What made those glowing eyes? What was in the attic crawl space? I never found out. The cabin was abandoned after that. No one ever rented it again. I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes, even in the city, when I'm alone, I swear I hear branches snapping or a low growl from the shadows. And I remember that night how real fear is and how it doesn't need ghosts or monsters to exist. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't see, just feel watching you in the dark. I'll start from the beginning so you can understand everything that led to what happened that weekend at the cabin. I'm not someone who usually does things like this. I'm not the type to go on camping trips or stay in remote cabins alone, but I needed to get away. My job had been draining me for months, and the stress was building up to the point where I just couldn't think straight. I decided to rent a small cabin out in the woods for a few days. The cabin was about 3 hours from the city, nestled deep in a national forest area, far from any towns or roads with much traffic. The idea was simple. Leave the phone behind, spend time outside, read books, sleep early, and get my head clear. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just that I'd be off the grid for a bit. I had the address and directions from the rental company, and I packed what I thought I'd need: warm clothes, food, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight, among other things. I was alone, but I didn't feel worried. I thought it would be peaceful. When I got to the cabin, it looked exactly like the pictures online. Small, rustic, but solid. There was a porch with a wooden swing and a stack of firewood near the door. The area was surrounded by tall pine trees, and the air smelled fresh and cool. The first day went well. I unpacked, made a fire, cooked some food, and settled in with a book. As the sun set, the forest grew quiet. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I felt calm, almost hypnotized by the warmth of the flames. I noticed how dark the sky was without any city lights. Stars were everywhere. But something about that night started to feel off. I went inside to sleep early, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Every small noise made me jump. Branches tapping against the cabin walls, a faint crunching sound outside. Even the wind seemed louder somehow. I told myself it was normal, that the forest was alive, and that I was just out of practice with this kind of solitude. I kept a flashlight on the nightstand just in case. Sleep came late, and when it did, it was restless. I dreamed of being watched. I woke up several times, my heart racing. Eventually, dawn came, and I felt a bit better. The second day, I decided to explore around the cabin. I walked the dirt trail that led away from the cabin, deeper into the woods. The trail was overgrown in some spots, like it hadn't been used much. I saw animal tracks, deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. Nothing dangerous, I thought. I made mental notes of how far I'd gone so I could find my way back. I also noticed something strange. Some of the trees around the cabin had marks on them, scratches or gouges in the bark. They looked fresh but didn't seem like the work of animals. I looked around carefully but didn't see any obvious signs of people nearby. I brushed it off as natural marks or maybe from some heavy machinery used to clear the path before. Back at the cabin, I started to feel more uneasy as the evening came again. I didn't want to admit it, but the feeling from the first night was back, stronger. It was as if someone was watching me from just beyond the trees. I stayed near the fire longer that night, watching the shadows dance on the ground. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt hostile. On the third day, I woke up early and decided to check the cabin carefully. I wanted to be sure the door locks worked well, windows were secure, and the firewood was still stacked properly. That's when I noticed something else. Some of the firewood had been disturbed. Not a lot, but enough to be suspicious. I stacked it back neatly and checked around the porch. No footprints, no trash, no clear sign that anyone had been there, but the feeling that I wasn't alone kept growing. I told myself I was imagining things. Maybe some animals had been nosing around. But then, that afternoon, I found a note. It wasn't a note with words. It was a pattern scratched into the dirt right beside the cabin door. Straight lines, circles, a shape that looked like an arrow pointing into the forest. It was clear someone had been there recently and wanted me to see it. My heart sank. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know if it was a prank, some hunters messing with me, or something worse. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the day, locking the doors and windows, double-checking the flashlight batteries. When night came, I barely slept. The fourth day was the worst. At some point in the early morning, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding, breath short. I heard footsteps outside. Not soft, but heavy, slow, deliberate. I stayed still, frozen. The footsteps moved around the cabin perimeter, sometimes stopping, then starting again. I looked out the window but only saw darkness and tree shapes. The flashlight was on the table, but I didn't want to move or make noise. The footsteps stopped near the porch. I thought about running but was scared I might make a noise that would give away my position. After what felt like forever, the footsteps moved away, slower now, until they faded into the distance. When the first light of dawn appeared, I stepped outside. I checked for footprints. There were several sets of heavy boot prints in the mud near the porch, some going into the woods, some coming back. Someone had been watching the cabin, waiting. I packed a small bag with essentials and my phone, which I had mostly ignored until then, and decided I needed to leave immediately. But the road was far, and I had no idea if my car was safe. As I walked to the car, I kept looking behind me, paranoid that someone was following. When I got to the car, it was fine, nothing broken or touched. I started the engine and sat inside for a moment, hands gripping the wheel, mind racing. Then I thought of something. I looked at the forest again, near the cabin, and I saw something in the trees. A figure standing still, just barely visible between the trunks. It didn't move when I looked directly at it. I couldn't tell if it was a person or just a trick of the light. I drove away fast without looking back. The whole drive home I was on edge, checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. When I finally got back to the city, I told the rental company what had happened and asked them if anyone else had reported strange things near that cabin. They said no, but they also seemed to brush it off like it was nothing. I didn't stay in touch with them after that. In the weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what happened. The scratches on the trees, the marks on the firewood, the note in the dirt, the footsteps at night. None of it added up. But then I remembered something I saw on the way to the cabin. There was a small sign near the main road that I had barely noticed because it was faded and old. It read, "Private property, no trespassing." I thought the cabin was inside public land, but maybe it wasn't. I searched online and found that the cabin's location was on the edge of a privately owned forest area. I looked at maps and found a network of logging roads around the cabin that were not public. It became clear that the people whose land it really was probably didn't want anyone there. And that explained the marks, the footsteps, the warnings scratched in the dirt. They had been watching, and when they saw someone unfamiliar, they had come close to intimidate or scare me off. I never went back. I learned something important. When you're out in the wild, especially near private land, you have to be aware that not all dangers come from animals or nature itself. Sometimes it's people who want to keep you away, and they don't care how they do it. I'm not a city person by nature, and I'd always thought the forest was a place to find peace. But that trip changed everything. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or anything supernatural. The real terror was real people. People who didn't want strangers on their land, who were willing to stalk, watch, and threaten someone they didn't know. I told myself I was lucky it didn't get worse. I never saw anyone close enough to identify, and they never tried to hurt me physically, but the threat was there. It was enough to make me pack up and leave in the middle of the night, scared and alone. That experience stayed with me for a long time. Now, I make sure I research every place I stay carefully. I always check land ownership, local warnings, and what others have experienced. And I'm never out in the woods alone again without knowing exactly where I'm going and who owns the land. The forest can be quiet, dark, and beautiful, but it can also hide things you don't expect. Not monsters or spirits, but people with their own reasons to be dangerous. That weekend in the cabin taught me that lesson the hard way.